Hi guys, welcome to Bedtime Stories. Tonight we're going to erase the cruise ships, the overpriced cappuccinos, and the guys selling glow-in-the-dark slingshots in St. Mark's Square. We are going to look at the improbable, muddy, and honestly kind of desperate origins of a city that technically shouldn't exist, Venice. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please do me a huge favor and hit that like button and subscribe. It honestly helps this new channel so much. It means the world to me. I'm always curious where everyone is listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there right now. I love reading those. It's really cool to see our global community connecting through these stories. Alright, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or heater for that soft white noise. Cuddle up with your dog or cat in your warm bed, and let's ease into tonight's journey. We have to start by completely reformatting your mental image of Venice. Right now, if you close your eyes and picture it, you probably see Renaissance palazzos, gondoliers in striped shirts, and maybe a pigeon trying to steal a sandwich from a tourist. It's romantic, it's the honeymoon capital. It's where George Clooney got married. But I want you to delete all of that. Go back 1500 years. We are in the 5th century AD. The vibe isn't romantic getaway. It's apocalyptic survival horror. The location is the same, but the landscape is totally different. There is no stone here. There are no bridges. There is no glass blowing. There is only a vast, silent, terrifying expanse of brackish water, mudflats and reeds. It's a lagoon, and not the blue lagoon with waterfalls and swaying palms. This is a salt marsh in northern Italy. It's humid. It smells like sulfur, rotting algae, and low tide. The air is thick with mosquitoes, big ones, the kind that carry malaria, or bad air as they called it back then. In the summer, the heat is heavy and wet, the kind that sticks your shirt to your back the second you step outside. In the winter, a bone-chilling fog rolls in off the Adriatic Sea, wrapping everything in a grey, damp blanket that makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. It is a hostile environment. Humans are terrestrial creatures. We like solid ground. We like knowing that if we put a foot down, we aren't going to sink up to our knees in grey sludge. Nobody looks at a mosquito-infested salt marsh and thinks, you know what? This is prime real estate. Let's build a marble cathedral right here. So, why are we here? Why is anyone here? Panic. Pure, unadulterated panic. To understand the birth of Venice, you have to look at the mainland. The Roman Empire, the biggest corporate monopoly the world had ever seen, is in the middle of a glorious, slow-motion collapse. It's the geopolitical equivalent of a massive tech company that stopped innovating 50 years ago and is now just hemorrhaging cash and firing middle management. The borders are porous, and coming through those borders are the barbarians. Now, barbarian is a bit of a loaded term, basically Roman slang for anyone who doesn't wear a toga and speak Latin, but in this specific context, we are talking about the Huns. And leading them is Attila the Hun, the scourge of God. Imagine the most aggressive biker gang you've ever seen, multiply it by 100,000, give them unparalleled horse archery skills, and remove any sense of mercy. Attila wasn't interested in taxation or bureaucracy. He was interested in looting, burning, and generally wrecking the place. He was the ultimate bad tenant. It's the year 452 AD. Attila is sweeping down through northern Italy. He hits the city of Aquileia. Aquileia was a major Roman hub, rich, comfortable, full of people who enjoyed heated floors and imported wine. Attila essentially deletes Aquileia from the map. He burns it so thoroughly that later historians would struggle to find where the buildings even stood. Now imagine you are a Roman living in the nearby towns of the Veneto region. You see the smoke rising on the horizon. You hear the stories of what happens when the Huns arrive. You have two choices. You can stay and hope Attila is in a good mood. Spoiler, he never is. Or you can run. But where do you run? The roads are dangerous. The open plains are exactly where the Huns excel. Their cavalry dominates flat ground. You can't outrun a horse on a Roman road. You need somewhere the horses can't go, somewhere so miserable, so treacherous, and so confusing that even the scourge of God will look at it and say, "Yeah, no thanks, I'm not getting my boots that muddy." You look toward the sea. You look at the lagoon. It's a maze of shifting sandbars and shallow channels. The water depth changes constantly with the tide. If you don't know the route, your boat gets stuck. If you try to ride a horse into it, the horse sinks. It is a natural fortress, guarded not by walls, but by muck. So, the refugees pack up, and this is the part that really gets me, the frantic downsizing. Imagine having to leave your comfortable suburban house in 20 minutes. You can't take the marble statue of your grandfather. You can't take the heavy oak dining table. You grab the girl, the kids, maybe some tools, and you run. They flee to the lagoon. They wade out into the water. This isn't a coordinated colonization effort. It's a chaotic scramble for safety. They land on these tiny, unstable islands. Torcello, Malamocco. Tiny patches of semi-solid ground peeking out of the water. This is the day one of Venice. It's not glamorous. It's refugee camps. It's people used to living in stone villas with running water, suddenly trying to build huts out of reeds and mud. It's glamping gone wrong. They are essentially castaways. Let's zoom in on that first night. The sun goes down, and it gets pitch black. There are no street lights, no ambient glow from a city, just the stars and the black water. You're huddled on a muddy bank, wrapping a damp wool cloak around yourself. The soundscape is just the lapping of water against the mud and the buzzing of insects. You can probably still smell the smoke from the burning mainland cities on the wind. It's a terrifying existence. You are waiting for the Huns to figure out how to build boats, but the Huns don't like water. They are steppe warriors. They look at the lagoon, shrug, and move on to easier targets. The water works. The moat works. At first, the refugees probably thought this was temporary. We'll just crash here on the mudflats for a few weeks until Attila gets bored and leaves. Then we'll go back to the mainland and rebuild the villa. It was a temporary fix. But the chaos on the mainland didn't stop. After the Huns, it was the Goths, then the Lombards. The temp situation became the new normal. It's like when you move into a place and don't unpack the last box because you think you're moving again soon, and then 5 years later that box is still there, serving as a TV stand. The Venetians, though they weren't calling themselves that yet, realized they were stuck. If they wanted to survive, they had to stop living like campers and start building a civilization. But how do you build a city where there is no land? This is where the genius and the insanity of Venice begins. They needed solid ground. The islands in the lagoon were mostly compressed mud and silt. If you put a heavy stone building on top of them, it would just sink like a crouton in soup. So they had to manufacture the land. They looked at the mainland, the place they had fled from, and they saw forests, oak, alder, larch. They went back under the cover of darkness or during lulls in the fighting, and they cut down trees. Millions of them. They brought these tree trunks back to the lagoon. Now, here is the engineering marvel that blows my mind every time I think about it. To make a foundation, they took these tree trunks, sharpened at one end like giant pencils, and drove them vertically into the mud. They didn't have hydraulic pile drivers. They had mallets, pulleys, and brute human strength. They hammered these logs down, 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 through the soft surface mud, until they hit the caranto, a layer of harder compressed clay and sand deep below the lagoon floor. And they didn't just use a few logs. They used forests. To build the foundation for just one future church, the Santa Maria della Salute, they would eventually use over 1 million wooden piles. Now you might be thinking, wait, wood rots, especially wood sticking in water. And usually you'd be right. If you leave a fence post in a puddle, it rots. But the magic of the Venetian lagoon is the mud itself. When you drive the wood completely underwater and bury it in that thick, airless mud, you seal it off from oxygen. Oxygen is what fungi and bacteria need to eat wood. Without oxygen, the wood doesn't rot. Instead, over centuries, the wood absorbs the minerals from the mud and water. It petrifies. It becomes hard as stone. So the Venice we see today, the palaces, the piazzas, the churches, it is all literally floating on a petrified forest. It's an upside-down forest, buried in the muck. If you could X-ray the city, it would look like a bed of nails, with the buildings balancing precariously on their heads of the pins. But in these early days, around the 6th and 7th centuries, we aren't at the marble palace stage yet. We are at the trying not to starve stage. Life was hard. The early Venetians had to reinvent their entire economy. On the mainland they were farmers or merchants. In the lagoon you can't farm wheat. You can't graze cows, they'd wander off and drown. So they turned to the only two resources they had in abundance: fish and salt. Fishing is obvious. The lagoon was teeming with life. Eels, crabs, shellfish. They became master fishermen out of necessity. But salt? Salt was the Bitcoin of the ancient world. Everybody needed it. You needed it to preserve food. Remember, no refrigerators. If you wanted your meat to last through the winter, you needed salt. The Venetians realized they were sitting on a gold mine. They could evaporate the seawater in shallow pans and harvest the crystals. It was back-breaking work, raking salt under the hot sun, the glare off the white crystals blinding you, your skin cracking from the brine. But it was valuable. They could trade salt with the mainlanders, the very people who had taken over their old homes, in exchange for wheat, wood, and fresh water. And that's another thing. Fresh water. The irony of Venice is that there is water everywhere, but you can't drink any of it. It's all salty or brackish. It's water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. Centuries before Coleridge wrote the poem. So how did they survive? They had to become experts at catching rain. Even in the earliest, poorest settlements, they started developing a system. They would pave a small square with impermeable limestone, sloping it toward the center. In the center was a drain that led to a cistern underground. But you couldn't just dump the water in. It would get nasty. So they filled the cisterns with sand. The rainwater would filter through the sand, which cleaned it, and collect in a well at the bottom. Every drop of fresh water they drank, cooked with, or washed with, fell from the sky and was carefully hoarded. It created a culture that was incredibly communal, but also incredibly fierce about resources. You didn't waste things in the lagoon. You couldn't afford to. Let's visualize the housing in this early period. Forget the stone palazzos, think wattle and daub. Woven reeds plastered with mud, topped with thatched roofs. The houses were light, so they wouldn't sink too fast. They were raised on stilts, hovering just above the high tide line. Life was dictated by the tides. Twice a day, the water rushes in. Twice a day, it rushes out. The currents in the lagoon are tricky. If the tide is going out, it can pull a boat out to sea faster than you can row. If the tide is coming in, it pushes water into your living room if you didn't build high enough. They lived in a constant rhythm with the moon and the sea. And let's not forget the isolation. In the beginning, this was their greatest asset, but it also made them weird. They were cut off from the rest of Italy. While the mainland was merging Roman culture with Germanic Lombard culture, evolving into what would become medieval Italy, the Venetians were out there in the swamp, looking east. Because they were coastal, their connection wasn't to the guys on horses in Milan, it was to the ships coming from Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire was still kicking, still rich, and still powerful. The Venetians technically considered themselves subjects of Byzantium. They wore Byzantine-style silks when they could afford them. They mimicked Byzantine art. They were the westernmost outpost of the East. This unique position, physically in the West, politically and culturally looking east, is what would eventually make them billionaires. They became the middlemen, the delivery drivers of the Middle Ages. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, in these early centuries, it's just gritty survival. Imagine the smells. We have to talk about the smells. I know we like to romanticize history, but sanitation in a lagoon settlement is complicated. There is no sewage system. The tide is the sewage system. You do your business and you hope the tide goes out and takes it away before it brings it back. The canals weren't the picturesque green waterways of today. They were functional, working arteries filled with fish guts, discarded oyster shells and human waste. The smell in the summer must have been staggering. It was a smell of life, rotting and regenerating, a biological engine churning away. And the silence. I keep coming back to that. At night, without the roar of cars or the hum of electricity, the lagoon is incredibly quiet. But sound carries over water. If a dog barked on an island a mile away, you'd hear it. If an oar splashed in the water, it sounded like a gunshot. This acoustic environment meant privacy was non-existent. If you were fighting with your spouse 3 huts down, the whole settlement knew. This bred a society that was tight-knit, suspicious of outsiders, and reliant on gossip. Information was currency in a place where a shifting sandbar could wreck your boat. Knowing the lay of the land or water was life or death. There was also a sense of democracy born of necessity. In the early days you didn't have kings, you had tribunes, leaders from the different islands. But eventually they realized they needed a central figure to coordinate defense because the pirates were coming. The Adriatic Sea was full of Slavic pirates, Narentines, who saw these little swamp settlements as easy pickings. The Venetians couldn't just hide anymore. They had to fight. They had to organize. In 697 AD, according to legend, though historians argue about the dates, because historians love to argue, the Venetians gathered and elected their first leader, a dux, a duke. In their dialect it became Doge, Paolo Lucio Anafesto, the first Doge. Now, Don't picture the Doge in the golden robes and the funny hat yet. This guy was basically a glorified warlord of the swamp. His job wasn't to sit in a palace. His job was to herd cats, or rather, herd stubborn fishermen, and organize a fleet to stop pirates from stealing their salt and their children. This was the seed of the Republic, a government formed not by divine right, not because God tapped a guy on the shoulder, but because a bunch of refugees realized that if they didn't organize, they were going to die. It was a pragmatic social contract, signed in mud. So, as we end this first part of our journey, I want you to leave behind the postcard image of Venice. I want you to picture a foggy dawn in the year 700. The water is grey and glassy. The air is cold and smells of brine. A small, flat-bottomed boat is gliding silently through the reeds. A man stands at the back, rowing with a single oar, the voga alla Veneta style, standing up so he can see the sandbars. He's not singing O Sole Mio. He's scanning the horizon for pirate sails or the glint of a Lombard spear on the mainland. He passes a cluster of wooden huts on stilts, where smoke is rising from breakfast fires. He sees men driving wooden stakes into the mud, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud echoing across the water. They are building a new foundation. They are stealing land from the sea. They don't know it yet, but they are laying the groundwork for the most serene, the most wealthy, and the most duplicitous republic in human history. They are building a machine that will chew up empires and spit out gold. But for now, they are just trying to keep their feet dry, and that effort to keep their feet dry eventually led them to a specific cluster of islands in the middle of the lagoon called Rivo Alto. You know it today as the Rialto. In Italian, Rivo Alto means high bank. Now, high is a relative term here. We aren't talking about the cliffs of Dover. We are talking about a mud bank that was maybe 2 feet higher than the other mud banks. But in a world where a stiff breeze and a high tide could flood your kitchen, 2 feet of elevation was the difference between a dry bed and sleeping in a puddle. It was prime real estate. But before the Rialto became the heart of the city, the Venetians tried living in a few other spots. They had a settlement called Malamocco, way out on the Lido, the barrier island facing the sea. It made sense at the time. It was closer to the open ocean, easier for ships to dock, but living on the barrier island is like living in a house with no front door, just a screen. You're exposed. And in the year 810 AD, the screen got kicked in. This brings us to the first major existential crisis of the Venetian state. The moment that basically decided, okay, we are doing this for real. It involves the son of Charlemagne, a guy named King Pepin. The Franks under Charlemagne had conquered almost everything in Europe. They were the unstoppable juggernaut of the Middle Ages. They looked at this weird little swamp community on the edge of their empire, which claimed to be loyal to the Byzantines in the east, and they got annoyed. It was like having a neighbor who refuses to join the HOA and flies a foreign flag on his lawn. So, King Pepin marches his army down to the edge of the lagoon. He captures the outlying islands. He takes Malamocco. The Venetians are terrified. They pile into their boats and retreat to Rivo Alto, the safest, most confusing part of the maze. Pepin stands on the shore of the Lido, looking across the water at Rivo Alto. It's tantalizingly close. He can see the smoke from their fires. He thinks, I have the greatest army in the world. I am not going to be stopped by a puddle. He orders his fleet to attack. He tries to build a bridge of boats. He tries to float his heavy, river-going vessels into the lagoon, and the lagoon does what the lagoon does best. It eats them. You see, the Venetian defenders didn't really have to do much. They just waited for the tide. The Franks didn't understand the tides. They tried to navigate the shallow channels at the wrong time. Their heavy ships ran aground on the sandbars. As the tide went out, the ships were stranded, tilted at crazy angles in the mud, helpless. The Venetians, in their light, flat-bottomed skiffs, swarmed out like wasps. They knew every channel, every deep spot. They peppered the stuck Franks with arrows. It was a massacre. It was the medieval equivalent of a tank division getting stuck in a swamp and being taken out by guys on jet skis. Pepin retreated, humiliated. He died shortly after. Some say of a fever contracted in the swamp, which feels like the lagoon getting the final word. This victory changed everything. It proved that the deep lagoon, specifically Rivo Alto, was impregnable. If the son of Charlemagne couldn't get to them, nobody could. So, they moved the government there permanently. They started driving more piles, draining more land, and knitting those little islands together with wooden bridges. But having a secure location wasn't enough. They were safe, sure, but they were nobodies. In the geopolitical hierarchy of the 9th century, Venice was a backwater fish market. They had no ancient lineage, no Roman ruins, and most importantly, no major religious clout. In the Middle Ages, your city's status was directly tied to your patron saint. It was a spiritual sponsorship deal. Rome had St. Peter, Constantinople had St. Andrew. These were the heavy hitters, the apostles. Having a top-tier saint's relics in your cathedral was like hosting the Olympics and the Super Bowl simultaneously, forever. It brought pilgrims, tourists, money, and divine protection. Venice had St. Theodore. Theodore was fine. He was a Greek warrior saint who killed a dragon, or a crocodile, depending on the art. But he was a B-list saint. He was the opening act. He wasn't going to put Venice on the map. The Venetians were ambitious. They wanted to be a superpower. They needed an apostle. They set their sights on St. Mark the Evangelist. St. Mark was a big deal. He wrote a gospel. He was associated with the lion, a symbol of power. The only problem was that St. Mark had been dead for about 800 years, and his body was in Alexandria, Egypt. Now, in the modern world, if you want something that belongs to someone else, you might negotiate, or maybe launch a hostile takeover. In the 9th century, you just stole it. There was actually a term for this, furta sacra, or holy theft. The logic was, if we steal the saint and we succeed, clearly the saint wanted to come with us. If he didn't want to come, he would have performed a miracle to stop us. It's gaslighting on a theological level. So, in 828 AD, two Venetian merchants named Buono and Rustico, good and rusty, which sounds like a hipster furniture brand, land their ship in Alexandria. Alexandria was under Muslim control at this point. The Caliphate was actually stripping down Christian churches to build mosques. Buono and Rustico go to the church where St. Mark is buried and start chatting up the monks. Specifically the guardian of the tomb. They basically say, "Hey, look, the Caliph is wrecking everything. St. Mark isn't safe here. Why don't you let us relocate him to a nice damp lagoon in Italy? He'll love it." The monks are hesitant, but then the local governor starts tearing down marbles from the church, and they panic. They agree to the heist. This is where it turns into a scene from a slapstick comedy. They open the tomb. They take St. Mark's body out. But they can't just leave an empty tomb, or people will notice immediately. So, and this is gruesome, but remember, dry realism, they take another body, St. Claudian, who was nearby and apparently less important, and they put him in St. Mark's shroud. They seal the tomb back up. Now they have the body of an apostle, but they have to get it from the church to their ship, through the streets of Alexandria, past the Saracen customs officials who check every crate. They need a cover. They need something that the Muslim guards will absolutely refuse to touch. Pork. They take the body of St. Mark, put it in a large woven basket, and cover it with layers of cabbage and pork meat, ham, bacon, whatever they had. They carry the basket to the docks. The customs official stops them. What's in the basket? The merchants, probably sweating bullets, just say, Khanzir. Khanzir, which is the local word for pig. The guards, disgusted, wave them through. Oh, get that out of here. They don't check. They don't look. It's the port gambit. It worked perfectly. They load the saint onto the ship and set sail. There's a legend that on the way back a terrible storm hit the ship while the captain was sleeping. St. Mark himself supposedly woke the captain up and told him to lower the sails, saving the ship from crashing into rocks. This was the first miracle, confirming that yes, Mark was totally cool with being kidnapped. They arrive in Venice. It is absolute pandemonium. The Doge, the bishop, everyone comes down to the docks. This was the moment Venice grew up. They had their verified check mark. They immediately fired St. Theodore, poor guy. You can still see him in Venice today. There are two massive granite columns in the Piazzetta San Marco, right by the water. On top of one is the winged lion, Marco. That's Theodore. He got demoted to vice patron. With St. Mark, Venice got a new symbol, the lion. And not just a lion with wings. And usually the lion is holding a book. If the book is open, it means Venice is at peace. If the book is closed and the lion is holding a sword, it means Venice is at war. It was the ultimate logo. You could put it on flags, on coins, on ships. It was branding genius. But beyond the branding, this had massive political implications. By having St. Mark, Venice could say to the Pope in Rome, hey, you have St. Peter, we have St. Mark, we're on the same level, you don't tell us what to do. It gave them spiritual independence, which they used to justify doing business with absolutely anyone, Christian or Muslim, Pope approved or not. So, they have the land, Rialto, they have the mascot, St. Mark, now they need the house. The Doge orders the construction of a basilica to house the body. The first St. Mark's Basilica wasn't the opulent gold-covered wonder you see today. It was a sturdy brick fortress church. It actually burned down in a rebellion a generic amount of time later. Venetians were prone to rioting and setting fire to the Doge's house when taxes got too high, but they rebuilt it, bigger and better each time. Let's settle into the atmosphere of this growing city in the 9th and 10th centuries. It's getting crowded. The empty spaces between the islands are being filled in. The method is always the same. Drive the piles, backfill with debris and mud, pave over with stone. The city is literally expanding like a living organism, eating the lagoon and turning it into stone. The canals are taking shape. The Grand Canal, which was originally the path of an ancient river flowing through the lagoon, becomes the main highway, but unlike a normal street, This highway moves. It breathes with the tide. The architecture is still heavily wood, but stone is starting to arrive. They are stripping Roman ruins from the mainland, stealing columns, capitals, and marbles from abandoned cities like Altinum and Aquileia. If you look closely at some of the oldest buildings in Venice, you'll see mismatched bricks and stones. It's a patchwork city, built from the recycled bones of the Roman Empire, and the society is becoming incredibly commercial. In other parts of Europe, the feudal system is locking everyone into place. You're a serf, you work the land, you die. You're a knight, you fight, you die. In Venice there is no land to work, there are no fields, so everyone from the richest family to the poorest sailor is involved in trade. It's a merchant republic. If you had a share in a ship, you could get rich. They developed a contract called the colleganza. It was basically the first venture capital system. A rich guy, the investor, puts up the money for a trading voyage. A poorer guy, the merchant, takes the risk, sails to Constantinople or Alexandria, and sells the goods. When he comes back, they split the profits. This allowed social mobility. A guy with nothing but guts and sailing skills could become a tycoon. This created a hustle culture. The city buzzed with it. The Rialto market wasn't just a place to buy fish, it was Wall Street. They traded spices, silks, slaves, timber, salt, and weapons. And because they were trading with everyone, the city started to look different. It didn't look Italian, it looked exotic. The arches on the windows started to curve like Islamic architecture. The mosaics looked Byzantine. The clothing was colourful silk, not drab wool. Venice was becoming a portal, a decompression chamber between East and West. If you were a German pilgrim heading to Jerusalem, you came to Venice. You stayed in a Venetian inn, you exchanged your silver for Venetian coins, and you booked passage on a Venetian ship. But with all this money came danger. The Adriatic was still a rough neighbourhood. There is a story from around this time, The Rape of the Brides of Venice, that captures the vulnerability and the violence of the era. According to tradition, all the marriages in Venice happened on a single day, the Feast of the Purification of the Virgin. It was a mass wedding event. The brides would carry their dowries, gold, jewelry, expensive fabrics, in small chests called arxella. So picture a procession of boats carrying these brides and their treasures to the church on the island of San Pietro di Castello. It's a festive day. Everyone is wearing their best. There is music. Suddenly, pirate ships burst out of a hiding spot. Narrantine pirates again. They storm the church, grab the brides, grab the gold, and take off. It's a nightmare scenario, but the Doge and the men of Venice don't hesitate. They jump into their boats and row like demons. They catch up to the pirates in a lagoon near Caroli. The battle is brutal. The Venetians are fighting for their wives and daughters. They slaughter the pirates to the last man. Legend says the water turned red with blood. They rescue the brides and the gold, and they return to the city in triumph. This event became an annual festival, the Festa delle Marie, celebrated for centuries. But it taught the Venetians a lesson. You can't just be rich. You have to be lethal. They started building the arsenal. Now, usually, when we say arsenal, we just mean a stockpile of weapons. But in Venice, the arsenale was a place, a massive, walled industrial complex. It was the first factory in history. Inside the high brick walls of the arsenal, the Venetian state began to standardize ship production. Before this, you built a ship, one at a time. The arsenal introduced the assembly line centuries before Henry Ford. They had standard designs for galleys. They had pre-cut timber. They had warehouses of ropes, sails, and anchors. At its peak, they could build a fully equipped warship in a single day. That is terrifying efficiency for the Middle Ages. This was the engine that would drive their empire. They weren't just merchants anymore. They were an industrialized naval power. They were building a fleet that could police the Adriatic, hunt down pirates, and project power all the way to the Holy Land. So, as we close this chapter, the muddy refugee camp is gone. The wooden huts are being replaced by stone. The fear of the Huns has been replaced by the confidence of the lion. They have their saint, they have their city, they have their factory, but they are about to get involved in the messiest, bloodiest, and most profitable enterprise of the medieval world, the Crusades. And specifically, a blind old man is about to step onto the stage who will turn this city into the master of the Mediterranean. The stage is set for the Golden Age. But first, they have to navigate the treachery of Byzantine politics and the chaotic ambition of knights in arms. That blind old man was Enrico Dandolo, and if you think a 90-year-old with no eyesight belongs in a nursing home playing bingo, you haven't met Enrico. He was the Doge of Venice in the early 13th century, and he is quite possibly the most terrifyingly competent CEO in history. Imagine a man who has lived 3 normal lifetimes. He was born around 1107. He had seen everything. He went blind somewhere in his 70s. Stories vary on how. Some say he was struck on the head during a riot. Others say the Byzantine emperor had him blinded with a burning glass during a diplomatic mission gone wrong. Whatever the cause, his eyes were clouded and useless, but his brain was razor-sharp. He didn't need to see you to know he was smarter than you. In 1201, the Fourth Crusade is being planned. The Pope Innocent III wants to retake Jerusalem, standard operating procedure for the Middle Ages. The French knights, the nobility of Europe, sign up. These guys are the jocks of the medieval world. Big armor, big swords, lots of enthusiasm, not a lot of logistical planning. They decide they aren't going to walk to Jerusalem this time, because walking is hot and you lose half your army to dysentery before you even get there. No, they're going to take the sea route. They're going to sail to Egypt, conquer it, and use it as a base to hit Jerusalem. But knights don't have ships, they have horses. So they send a delegation to the only people who can build a fleet that big, Venice. The French envoys arrive in Venice and meet with blind old Dandolo in St. Mark's Basilica. They lay out their order. It's massive. They need transport for 4,500 knights, 9,000 squires, 20,000 foot soldiers, and, this is the kicker, 4,500 horses. Have you ever tried to put a horse on a boat? It's a nightmare. You need special slings, special ramps, and specialized stalls so the horses don't break their legs when the ship rolls. Venice has to design these ships from scratch. Dandolo listens. He does the mental math. He says, okay, we can do this, but we will have to stop the entire economy of our city for a year. No trading, no other contracts, just your ships. So, the price is 85,000 silver marks, and we want half of whatever you conquer. The French envoys, who are basically writing a check, their bank account can't cash, say, deal. Venice gets to work. This is the arsenal operating at maximum capacity. The sound in the city for that entire year must have been deafening. Hammers, saws, the hissing of hot pitch. They strip the forests of the mainland bare. They build a fleet of 500 ships. It is the greatest maritime logistical feat the world has ever seen. It's like a small country deciding to build the entire US Navy in 12 months. Summer of 1202 rolls around. The ships are ready. They are bobbing in the lagoon, smelling of fresh tar and cut wood. The Venetians are ready to get paid. And then the Crusaders start trickling in. The problem is, the French envoys had overestimated how many guys would actually show up. They promised 33,000 men, only about 11,000 arrive. This is a disaster. It's like reserving a wedding venue for 500 guests and only 50 show up, but you still have to pay for the 500 lobster dinners. The Crusaders pool all their money, they sell their silverware, they shake out the sofa cushions. They can only come up with 51,000 marks. They are 34,000 marks short. The Venetians are furious. They have suspended their economy for this. They have bills to pay. They blockade the Crusaders on the island of Lido. Picture the scene on the Lido. It's a hot Italian summer. You have thousands of frustrated, heavily armed French knights camping on a sandbar. They are running out of food. They are getting sunburnt. The Venetians are circling in their boats, basically saying, "You don't leave until we get our money." It's a hostage situation, but the hostages are an army. Dandolo, the blind genius, sees an opportunity. He knows they can't pay, but he has a massive army sitting on his doorstep, owing him a favor. He goes to the Crusader leadership and makes them an offer. "Look, you can't pay, we can't let you leave, but there is a city down the coast called Zara." Zara, modern-day Zadar in Croatia, was a rival trading city. It used to belong to Venice, but it rebelled and placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. The King of Hungary, crucially, is also a Catholic monarch. Dandolo says, "Help us smash Zara, re-establish Venetian control, and we'll pause the debt. We'll call it even for now, and then we'll sail to Egypt." The Crusaders are torn. Attacking a Christian city? That's strictly forbidden. The Pope will go ballistic. But they are starving on a sandbar. So they agree. In November 1202, the greatest fleet in Europe sets sail. Not to fight the infidel, but to mug a neighbor. They arrive at Zara. The citizens of Zara are terrified. They hang crosses and banners of the Virgin Mary over the walls, basically shouting, "Hey, we're Christians. We're on the same team." It doesn't matter. The Crusaders and Venetians attack. They smash the walls. They sack the city. It's brutal. They divide the loot. The Pope, Innocent III, hears about this. He is apoplectic. He writes a furious letter excommunicating the entire crusade. Excommunication in the 13th century is a big deal. It means you are spiritually cut off, you can't receive sacraments, and you are going to hell. Dandolo intercepts the letter. He literally suppresses the mail. He literally suppresses the mail. He doesn't tell the common soldiers. He figures what they don't know will hurt them. He keeps the army moving. They spend the winter in Zara. It's cold, damp, and tensions are high between the French and the Venetians. They get into fistfights over the loot. Then, just when you think this road trip can't get any weirder, a new character enters the chat. Alexios IV Angelos. He is a young Byzantine prince. His father, the Emperor Isaac II, had been deposed, blinded, it was a popular punishment back then, and thrown in prison by his own brother, Alexios' uncle. Young Alexios had escaped and was touring the courts of Europe, looking for someone to help him get his throne back. He finds the Crusaders at Zara. He pitches them the ultimate deal. He says, "If you guys divert your fleet to Constantinople and help me kick out my usurper uncle and put me on the throne, I will give you 1, 200,000 silver marks, enough to pay off the Venetians and then some, 2, 10,000 Byzantine soldiers for your crusade to Egypt, and 3, I will place the Orthodox Church under the authority of the Pope." It is a lie, a massive delusional lie. The Byzantine Empire was broke. He didn't have the money. The people of Constantinople would never accept the Pope. But the Crusaders and Venetians don't know that. They just hear 200,000 marks. Dandolo loves this plan. Why? Because Venice hates Constantinople's trade restrictions. If they can install a puppet emperor who owes them money, Venice wins the game. So the crusade, which was supposed to go to Jerusalem, then Egypt, then Zara, now takes a hard left turn toward Turkey. Let's visualize the journey. It's the spring of 1203. The fleet is sailing through the Greek islands. The weather is improving. The water is that deep, impossible Aegean blue. The soldiers are polishing their armor, thinking they are about to get rich easy. Just a quick regime change, then off to the Holy Land. They sail up the Sea of Marmara, and then the skyline appears, Constantinople. It is impossible to overstate the shock the Crusaders and Venetians must have felt. In 1203, Paris was a muddy town of maybe 60,000 people. London was even smaller. Venice was growing, but still wood and brick. Constantinople had a population of 400,000. It was the Rome of the East. It was paved with marble. It had street lights. It had automated mechanical birds in the emperor's palace. It had the Hagia Sophia, a dome so big they said it was suspended from heaven by a golden chain. And the walls, the Theodosian walls, a triple layer of fortifications that had never been breached in 800 years. Attila the Hun couldn't break them. The Arabs couldn't break them. They were the ultimate keep-out sign. A French chronicler named Villeruin wrote, "I can assure you that all those who had never seen Constantinople before gazed very intently at the city, for they never thought there could be in all the world so rich a city, and they trembled to think that they would have to take so rich a place." The fleet anchors on the Asian side of the Bosphorus. They look across the water at the imperial city. The Byzantines look back. The current emperor, the usurper Uncle Alexius III, isn't worried. He sees the ships and thinks, whatever, we have the walls, we have the Varangian Guard, light Viking mercenaries. These barbarians will get tired and leave. He doesn't even bother to fix the neglected navy. But he underestimated the Venetians. The Venetians are amphibious. They look at the sea walls, the walls that face the harbour, and they think, we can work with this. First, they have to get into the harbour, the Golden Horn. The harbour is blocked by a massive iron chain stretched across the water, from the city to a tower on the other side. You can't sail through it. The Venetians build a special ship, a scissors ship. They reinforce the hull, put a massive pair of shears or a ram on the front, and drive it straight at the chain at full speed. Snap! The chain breaks. The fleet pours into the Golden Horn. Now they are parked right under the northern walls of the city. The assault begins on July 17, 1203. And here is where we see the difference between the French and the Venetians. The French attack the land walls. They put up ladders. They fight on foot. It's a grind. They are getting hammered by rocks and Greek fire, liquid napalm. The Venetians attack the sea walls, and Dandolo pulls a move that is pure Hollywood. The Venetian ships have built flying bridges, wooden platforms suspended from the masts. When the ships pull up against the seawall, the platforms are level with the top of the battlements. The fighting is fierce, the Venetians are hesitating, the defenders are raining down arrows. Suddenly, the blind Doge, 95 years old now, dressed in full armour, stands at the prow of his galley. He screams at his men, "Put me ashore, or I will deal with you myself." He holds the banner of Sir Mark. His men are terrified that their ancient leader is going to get killed, so they drive the ship onto the beach. Dandolo is the first one off, or carried off. Seeing the old man charge, the Venetians go berserk. They swarm the walls, they bridge the gap from the ships. They capture 25 towers. Meanwhile, inside the city, the Emperor Alexios III panics. He has the larger army, but he has no spine. He packs as much gold as he can carry, takes his favorite daughter, and flees the city in the middle of the night. He leaves his wife and the rest of his family behind. Father of the Year. The city wakes up. The emperor's gone. The officials, wanting to avoid a sack, go down to the dungeons, drag out the old, blind, deposed Emperor Isaac II, put his robes back on him, and sit him on the throne. They open the gates. "Hey guys, it's all good. We put the old guy back in charge. War's over." The Crusaders are confused but happy. They bring young Alexius IV into the city. He is crowned co-emperor with his father. Mission accomplished. They did it. Now, time for the payment. "So," the Crusaders say, tapping their foot, "about that 200,000 marks?" Alexius IV looks at the treasury. It's empty. His uncle stole everything when he ran. He looks at the Crusaders. He starts sweating. Can I pay you in installments?" This is the beginning of the end. The Crusaders and Venetians decide to camp outside the city in the suburb of Galata and wait for their money. Weeks pass, months pass. Alexios IV tries everything. He melts down icons from the churches to make coins. This makes the Greek population hate him. They call him a traitor and a Latin lover. The Crusaders hate him because he's not paying fast enough. He is trapped in the middle. Tension rises. Drunken Crusaders starting fires in the city. A massive fire burns down a huge chunk of Constantinople. Now the locals really hate the Westerners. In January 1204, a palace coup happens. A nobleman named Montseuflos, which means the guy with the unibrow, seriously his eyebrows met in the middle, overthrows Alexios IV. He strangles him to death with a bowstring. Montseuflos climbs the walls and shows the Crusaders their puppet emperor's body. He says, "The deal is off, get out of here." Now the mood changes. It's no longer a diplomatic dispute, it's war. And this time, it's not about regime change, it's about survival and revenge. The Crusaders are stuck. They have no money, no food, and they are deep in hostile territory. If they retreat, they starve. If they stay, they have to fight. The bishops with the crusade, who have conveniently ignored the Pope's orders, gather the troops. They give a sermon. They say, "Look, these Greeks, they murdered their king. They are schismatics. They are basically not even real Christians. It is God's will that we take this city." They justify the unjustifiable. They reframe a looting expedition as a holy war. Dandolo and the Venetian engineers get back to work. They refit the ships. They tie the ships together in pairs to create massive siege towers. that loom over the city walls. They wait for a strong north wind. On April 12, 1204, the wind picks up. The great fleet moves in. The final assault begins. The Venetian ships crash against the towers. A bridge is lowered. A Venetian sailor and a French knight jump onto a tower. They hack their way in. The gates are forced open. The Crusaders pour into the city. Mousuflos, the unibrow, flees. It seems to be a tradition for Byzantine emperors. The city of Constantinople, the eye of the world, the guardian of civilization, lies open and defenseless. What happens next is considered one of the greatest crimes in history. For 3 days, the Crusaders and Venetians lose all control. They don't just loot, they destroy. They smash into the Hagia Sophia. They drink wine from the holy chalices. They put a prostitute on the patriarch's throne to sing bawdy songs. They melt down ancient Greek bronze statues, works of art from antiquity that are lost forever, just to make coins. But the Venetians are different. While the French are smashing things in a drunken rage, the Venetians are shopping. Dandolo has given them a list. They know exactly what is valuable. They don't melt down the art, they steal it. They take the 4 bronze horses from the hippodrome, ancient, priceless sculptures. They carefully lower them onto their ships. These are the horses that stand on St. Mark's Basilica today. They take the tetrarchs, a porphyry statue of 4 Roman emperors. They take enamels, gold cups, crystal bowls, relic. They strip the city of its best assets with surgical precision. When the smoke clears, the Byzantine Empire is dead. The Crusaders divide the land. They invent a Latin Empire of Constantinople. They elect a French guy, Baldwin of Flanders, as emperor. But the real winner is Venice. Dandolo takes the title, Lord of 1/4 and 1/2 of the Roman Empire. Venice claims the best islands, Crete, Corfu, Naxos. They take the strategic ports. They now control the trade route from the Black Sea to the Adriatic. The swamp city has just swallowed the whale. Enrico Dandolo, the blind old man, dies in Constantinople a year later, in 1205. He is buried in the Hagia Sophia. He never went back to the lagoon. He didn't need to. He had turned his city into an empire. But back in the lagoon, with all this new wealth pouring in, the city of Venice is about to undergo a physical transformation. The wood is going to disappear, the marble is going to rise, and the government is going to become even more paranoid, even more secret and even more terrifying, because now that they are rich, they have to make sure nobody steals it from them. And that paranoia didn't take long to set in. When the ships from Constantinople finally returned to the lagoon, low in the water, heavy with the plunder of an empire, the city underwent a sudden, violent cosmetic surgery. Imagine the scene at the Piazzetta. Enormous cranes, wooden treadmills powered by men running inside wheels like hamsters, hoisting those 4 bronze horses up onto the loggia of the basilica. They didn't fit the style. They were Roman realism clashing with Byzantine mosaics. But that was the point. They were a trophy. They were a flex. They said, "We didn't just beat the empire, we own its history now." The city began to dress itself in stolen jewelry. Pillars of jasper, porphyry and verdantique were unloaded and slapped onto the facades of churches and palaces. If you look closely at St. Mark's today, you'll see that the columns on the front don't match. Some are fat, some are thin, some have different carvings. It's because they were looted from different buildings in different centuries. The basilica is essentially a scrapbook made of marble, but as the facades got prettier, the politics got uglier. See, all this new wealth created a problem. In the old days, the nobility were just the guys who had the biggest boats and the most salt. It was fluid. If you were a nobody but you got lucky on a trade run to Alexandria, you could buy your way into the club. But the old families, the Dandalos, the Morosinis, the Gradenicos, looked at their piles of Byzantine gold and thought, you know what would be terrible? If we had to share this. They decided to pull up the ladder. In 1297, they passed a series of laws known as the Serrata del Maggior Consiglio, the locking of the Great Council. Before this, the Great Council, the Parliament of Venice, was somewhat open. After the Serrata, it was shut tight. If your father or grandfather hadn't sat on the council during a specific 4-year window, you were out. Forever. They created a registry, the Libro d'Oro, the Golden Book. If your family's name was in the book, you were a patrician. You could vote, you could hold office, you could wear the specific silk robes that marked you as a somebody. If your name wasn't in the book, it didn't matter how rich you were, you could be the Elon Musk of the 14th century, buying and selling whole fleets of ships, but politically you were a nobody. You were a citizen, sure, but you would never, ever be a ruler. It was a brilliant, cold-blooded maneuver. It turned Venice into a closed caste system, an oligarchy, a country run by a boardroom of about 200 families who simply agreed to never let anyone else in. And like any exclusive club, once they locked the doors, they started getting paranoid that someone would try to burn the building down. This brings us to the year 1310, and a guy named Bagamonte Tiepolo. Tiepolo was a nobleman, but he was angry. He hated the current doge, Pietro Gradenigo, the guy responsible for the Serrata. Tiepolo decided the only way to fix things was the old-fashioned way, a coup. He gathered a bunch of disaffected conspirators. His plan was simple. They would gather their armed supporters, storm the Piazza San Marco in the middle of a storm for cover, kill the Doge, and take over. It was a disaster. First, it rained too hard. The conspirators got separated in the winding streets. Second, the Doge had spies everywhere. He knew they were coming. When Tiepolo's men marched into the piazza, shouting liberty, they were met by the Doge's heavily armed guards. But the pivotal moment of the coup wasn't a sword fight, it was a potted plant. As Tiepolo's standard-bearer, the guy holding the flag, was marching down the Mercerie, the main shopping street, a woman named Giustina Rossi looked out her window to see what the commotion was. She was an old lady. She had a heavy stone mortar, a bowl for grinding spices, on her windowsill. In her excitement, or clumsiness, she knocked the mortar off the ledge. It fell 3 stories. Crunch. It landed directly on the head of the standard-bearer, killed him instantly. The flag fell. In medieval warfare, when the flag goes down, everyone panics. The rebels thought their leader was dead. They broke and ran. The coup was defeated by gravity and a kitchen appliance. The Doge was relieved, but also terrified. They realized how close they had come to losing everything. They decided that the regular courts and the regular police weren't enough. They needed something faster, something quieter, something that didn't need evidence or defense attorneys. Originally, it was supposed to be a temporary emergency committee, just to clean up the mess from the conspiracy. But, as we know from history, There is nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. The Council of Ten, il Consiglio dei Dieci, became the most feared institution in Europe. They were the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA rolled into one, wearing velvet robes and masks. They had absolute power over state security. They met in secret in a special room in the Doge's palace. They didn't keep minutes of their discussions, only their decisions, and their reach was terrifying. They utilized a tool that would make George Orwell shudder, the bouche de lion, the lion's mouths. Walk around the Doge's palace today, and you'll see these weird stone carvings of lion faces set into the walls. Their mouths are open slots. They were suggestion boxes, but not for how can we improve the cafeteria. They were for who is betraying the state. Anyone could drop a note into a lion's mouth. An anonymous denunciation. My neighbor is talking to the French ambassador. The baker is hoarding salt. Senator Barbaro is complaining about the Doge. The Council of Ten read every single note. Now, to be fair, they had rules. You couldn't just accuse someone because you hated them. You needed witnesses, usually. But the psychological effect was devastating. It turned the entire population into potential informants. You couldn't trust your brother, you couldn't trust your wife, you definitely couldn't trust your servants. Silence became the most valuable commodity in Venice. The Council of Ten had their own budget. They had their own codes. They had their own spies, the confidants, who roamed the taverns and brothels, listening for loose talk. And they had their own executioners. If the Ten wanted you gone, you didn't get a public trial. You just disappeared. You might be arrested at night, taken across the Bridge of Sighs, and thrown into the pozzi, the wells damp, lightless dungeons at the water level. Or, if you were a VIP, you went to the Piondi, the leads, right under the lead roof, where you roasted in summer and froze in winter, and sometimes the lagoon just solved the problem. A sack, a heavy stone, a quiet splash at midnight. He went on a long voyage, they'd say. This system was brutal, but, and here is the cynical part, it worked. While the rest of Italy was tearing itself apart with family feuds, think Romeo and Juliet, Guelphs and Capulets, Guelphs and Ghibellines, Venice was stable, stone cold stable. The government didn't change for 500 years. But what happens when the threat comes from the very top? This brings us to the most dramatic episode in Venetian political history, the case of Marin Faliero. The year is 1355. Marin Faliero is the Doge. He is old, rich, and a war hero, but he is frustrated. Being Doge sounds cool, but by the 14th century, the job kind of sucked. The council had stripped away almost all his real power. The Doge couldn't leave the palace without permission. He couldn't open his own mail. He couldn't meet foreign ambassadors alone. He was a prisoner in a golden cage. He was a mascot. Faliero had a young, beautiful wife. At a carnival party, a young, arrogant nobleman named Michele Steno got drunk and wrote some nasty graffiti on the Doge's chair. Something like, Marin Faliero has a beautiful wife. He pays for her, but others enjoy her. It was a crude frat boy joke. Faliero was furious. He demanded Steno be punished severely. But Steno was a member of the council. The old boys' club protected him. They gave him a slap on the wrist, a month in jail and a small fine. Faliero snapped. He realized that, as Doge, he was powerless against the aristocracy. He decided to burn the system down. He hatched a plot. He would use the common people, the shipwrights from the arsenal, the sailors who also hated the arrogant nobles. They would stage a riot, claim that the Genoese fleet was attacking, and in the confusion they would slaughter the Great Council and declare Faliero the Prince of Venice a dictator. Venice is a city of secrets, and secrets leak. One of the conspirators got cold feet. He warned a friend on the council to stay home on the day of the coup. The friend told the 10. The machine sprang into action. The Council of 10 didn't hesitate. They arrested the ringleaders. They tortured them. They got the name, the Doge himself. Imagine the shock. The head of state is the traitor. In any other country this would be a civil war. In Venice it was a procedural matter. The 10 arrested the Doge. They put him on trial in his own palace. He confessed. On April 17, 1355, at sunset, they led Marin Faliero out to the top of the marble staircase in the courtyard of the Doge's palace, the same spot where he had been crowned. They stripped off his ducal robes. They took off the corno, the funny hat, and there, in the silence of the courtyard, the executioner swung a sword and chopped off his head. They left the body there for a day as a warning. Justice has been done on the traitor. But the pettiness didn't stop there. They went into the hall of the Great Council, where the portraits of all the doges are painted in a frieze around the ceiling. They found Faliero's portrait. They painted over it with black paint. If you go to the Doge's palace today, look up. You'll see a line of solemn faces, Doge after Doge, and then you'll see a black rectangle. On it, written in white Latin script, Hic est locus Marini Falieri decapitati pro criminibus. This is the place of Marini Falieri, beheaded for his crimes. It is the ultimate damnatio memoriae. They didn't just kill him, they edited him out of the corporate yearbook. This sent a chill down the spine of every future Doge. The message was clear. The state is bigger than you. The system is bigger than any individual. You are a cog. If the cog malfunctions, we replace it. So, by the late 1300s, Venice is a terrifyingly efficient police state. But it's also undeniably beautiful. This is the era of Venetian Gothic. Because they were rich and secure, they started building palaces that looked like lace. Look at the Cadoro, the House of Gold, or the Doge's palace itself. In Florence or Rome, palaces were fortresses. Thick walls, small windows, rusticated stone. They were built to withstand a siege from the neighbors. In Venice, the palaces have huge windows, delicate traceried loggias, open facades. Why? Because they didn't need fortresses. The water was their wall, and the police state was their security. You didn't need to guard your house, because the Council of 10 was guarding the city. It was a weird paradox. The lack of freedom led to an architecture of lightness and openness. And inside those palaces, the luxury was getting out of hand. The government actually had to pass sumptuary laws to stop people from showing off too much. They regulated everything: how much jewelry a woman could wear, how many courses you could serve at dinner, how much marzipan was allowed at a wedding. Seriously, they regulated the marzipan. They even regulated the gondolas. In the early days, gondolas were colourful. Nobles would paint them gold, red, blue, cover them in silk. It was a traffic jam of peacocks. The government said, "Enough, this is tacky, and it's making the poor people jealous." They passed a law. All gondolas must be painted black. Uniform matte black. That's why the gondolas are black today. It wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was a government mandate to enforce a weird kind of socialist modesty on the ultra-rich. You can be rich, but don't rub it in. But while the Venetians were busy regulating marzipan and beheading Doge, a shadow was rising in the west. Genoa. If Venice was the New York of the Mediterranean, mercantile, rich, organized, Genoa was Chicago, rougher, grittier, and they hated Venice with a passion that bordered on insanity. Genoa and Venice were twins, both maritime republics, both relied on trade, both wanted the same markets. They were two scorpions in a bottle. For 100 years they had been skirmishing, burning each other's trading posts in the Crimea, ramming each other's ships off the coast of Greece. But it was sustainable violence, just the cost of doing business. But in the late 14th century, the rivalry went terminal. Genoa decided they didn't just want to compete, they wanted to exterminate. The War of Chioggia was about to begin. This wasn't a war fought in some distant colony. This was a war for the lagoon itself. The Genoese fleet was coming for Venice, and this time they weren't going to get stuck in the mud like King Pepin. They had better charts, they had better ships, and they had surrounded the city. Imagine Venice in 1379. The blockade is tight, no food is coming in, the warehouses are emptying, the bread is running out, the city is starving. You can stand on the bell tower of St. Mark's and see the Genoese ships anchored just a few miles away at Chioggia, the southern entrance to the lagoon. They are waiting for Venice to die. The Doge, Andrea Contarini, is old. The Admiral, Vettor Pisani, is actually in jail because he lost a battle earlier. Venice was tough on failure. The people are rioting, demanding Pisani be released. Release him, the crowd chants. Only he can save us. The government, desperate, opens the prison cell. Pisani walks out. He doesn't hold a grudge. He walks to the docks. He looks at the pathetic remnants of the Venetian fleet. He turns to the starving, terrified crowd and says, "Bring me your boats. Bring me anything that floats." It is the darkest hour. The candle is flickering. The empire of the lion is about to be extinguished by the cross of St. George, the Genoese flag. But Venice, as we have seen, is like a cockroach. It is incredibly hard to kill, and they are about to pull off the greatest naval trap in history. Sir Vettor Pisani stands there on the docks. He has just been released from prison. He looks terrible, gaunt, bearded, smelling of the dungeon, but he has the fire. He tells the crowd, if you want to live, get in a boat, and Venice, in its collective panic, listens. This is the Dunkirk of the 14th century, but in reverse. They aren't evacuating, they are attacking. The grandmothers, the bakers, the glassblowers, everyone piles into whatever floats. Fishing scows, rafts, leaking barges. They load them with stones. It's December, the lagoon is freezing. A thick fog, the nebbia, lies over the water. You can't see 10 feet in front of you. The Genoese are camped down in Chioggia, at the southern entrance to the lagoon. They are warm. They are eating the Venetians' food. They are laughing. They think the war is over. They are waiting for the spring to sail up the Grand Canal and finish the job. They didn't count on Pisani. Pisani knows he can't beat the Genoese fleet in a straight fight. They have bigger ships and better sailors. So he decides to change the geography. Under the cover of a freezing winter night, the Venetian ragtag fleet rows silently down to the channels that lead out of Chioggia. There are 3 exits. Pisani plans to plug them. He takes those heavy barges filled with rocks. the arcs of stone, tows them into the middle of the channels and scuttles them. Glug, glug, glug. Down they go. Then he drives piles around them. He literally builds a wall underwater. The Genoese wake up the next morning hungover, ready to maybe sail out and harass a few fishing boats. They hit the blockage. They turn around to try the other exit. Blocked. The third exit. Blocked. They are trapped. The besiegers have become the besieged. Now the tables turn. Venice still has no food, but they have grit. They sit there in their little boats in the freezing rain, guarding the exits. They mount cannons, primitive, scary bombard that explode as often as they fire. On the mudflats, they pound the Genoese ships. The Genoese start to starve. They eat their horses. Then they eat their leather boots. Then they eat rats. Months go by. It is a staring contest of endurance. Finally, in June 1380, the Genoese commander surrenders. The Venice fleet, what's left of it, tows the captured Genoese galleys back to St. Mark's Square. It was a near-death experience. Venice had looked into the abyss, and the abyss blinked. Genoa was broken. They would never again challenge Venice for dominance of the Mediterranean. They went back to banking and making pesto. Venice was now the undisputed heavyweight champion of the sea, and this victory launched the Quattrocento, the 1400s, the golden century. If you traveled to Venice in the mid-1400s, you were visiting the richest, most dazzling city on earth. It was New York, Paris, and Las Vegas rolled into one. The population hit 180,000. That's huge for a medieval city, and it was a machine that printed money. But the Venetians, being the paranoid survivalists they were, learned a lesson from the War of Chioggia. You can't eat gold. During the siege, they had almost starved because they relied entirely on imported food. They realized that having a sea empire, Stato de Mar, was great for luxury goods, but terrible for food security. They needed farms. They needed cows. They needed solid ground. So they did something they had avoided for centuries. They turned around and looked at Italy. They began the conquest of the terra firma, the mainland. They marched inland. They took Padua. They took Verona, Romeo. They took Vicenza, Bergamo, Brescia. They pushed their border all the way to the Alps. This changed the character of the nobility. The old sea captains started buying estates. They built Palladian villas, those beautiful country houses you see in the Veneto today. They started growing corn and grapes. They diversified their portfolio. It was hedging, 15th century style. But while they were looking west at the cornfields, a monster was growing in the east. The Ottoman Empire. For centuries, Venice had dealt with the Byzantines. The Byzantines were tricky, bureaucratic, and occasionally blindingly cruel. But they were familiar. They were the devil you knew. The Ottomans were different. They were an expanding, dynamic, militaristic juggernaut, and they wanted Constantinople. Venice sent some help, but not enough. They were hesitant. When the city fell, and the last Byzantine emperor died fighting on the walls, a shock wave went through Christendom. It was the end of the Middle Ages. The Roman Empire was finally, officially dead. The Pope screamed for a crusade. Retake the city. Fight the infidel. Venice? Venice checked its ledger. They realized that fighting the Ottomans was bad for business. The Ottomans now controlled the Silk Road. If Venice wanted pepper, silk, and spices, they had to deal with the Sultan. So while the rest of Europe was sharpening swords, Venice sent a diplomat. They signed a peace treaty. They agreed to pay a tribute, basically protection money, to the Sultan in exchange for the right to keep trading. The rest of Europe called them traitors. How can you do business with the enemy of the faith? The Venetians shrugged and uttered one of their most famous phrases, Siamo Veneziani, poi Cristiani, we are Venetians, then Christians. Priorities, people. This pragmatism allowed them to maintain their monopoly. The spice flowed, the gold flowed, and with the gold came art, culture, and intellect. Let's walk through the streets of 15th century Venice. It's not just a city of merchants anymore. It's a city of brains. Because Constantinople fell, thousands of Greek scholars fled. They brought with them manuscripts that the West had forgotten. Plato, Aristotle, the original Greek texts of the Bible. They landed in Venice, and they met a man named Aldus Manutius. Aldus was the Steve Jobs of the Renaissance. Before him, books were massive, hand-copied, expensive objects that you had to read on a lectern. Aldus looked at the new technology, the printing press, and had an idea. He invented the italic font. Why? Because it was slanted and compact. You could fit more words on a page. This meant you could make the book smaller. He invented the libelluli, portable books, paperbacks, pocket editions. Suddenly you could put Sophocles in your pocket. You could read Virgil on a boat. You could read in bed. This revolutionized knowledge. Venice became the printing capital of the world. The air in the Rialto district smelled of ink and binding glue. If you were a writer, a thinker, or a scientist, you came to Venice. Why? Because the Inquisition wasn't really a thing there. Remember, Venice ignored the Pope whenever it suited them. In Rome, if you wrote a book saying the earth revolved around the sun, you might get burned at the stake. In Venice, the Council of 10 would look at the book and say, "Does it sell? Is it profitable? Great, print 500 copies." They offered intellectual asylum. It was a free speech zone. As long as you didn't criticize the Venetian government, you could say whatever you wanted about God. Just don't talk smack about the Doge. And then there was the luxury, the conspicuous consumption. This is the era of the carnival getting out of control. It went from a religious festival to a months-long party. Masks became everyday wear. Why masks? Because in a small city where everyone knows everyone, you need anonymity to be naughty. If you wore a bauta, the white, ghost-like mask, and a black cloak, you were genderless and classless. A nobleman could gamble with a sailor. A nun could meet a lover. A spy could listen to a conversation. The mask was the VPN of the Renaissance. It allowed the rigid social structure to bend without breaking. And at the center of this social whirl were the courtesans, the courtisanes, honeste, the honest courtesans. These weren't streetwalkers. They were high-class companions, the geishas of Italy. They were educated. They could quote poetry, play the lute, discuss politics. The most famous was Veronica Franco. She was a poet, a celebrity, and arguably one of the most powerful women in the city. When the King of France visited Venice, he didn't just want to see the arsenal. He requested an evening with Veronica Franco. She represents the Venetian spirit of the age. Beautiful, expensive, cultured, and completely transactional. But Venice's hunger for control didn't stop at the bedroom door. It extended to entire kingdoms, and the story of how they acquired the island of Cyprus is the ultimate example of their corporate gangsterism. Cyprus was a crucial strategic island. It was rich in sugar and cotton. It was ruled by the Lusignan family, a dynasty of Crusader kings. The King of Cyprus, James II, fell in love with a Venetian girl named Caterina Cornaro. The Venetian government saw this, and their eyes turned into dollar signs. They declared Caterina the daughter of Saint Mark. They gave her a massive dowry. They basically sponsored the wedding. She goes to Cyprus, she becomes queen. Then, in suspicious circumstances, standard for the era, the king dies suddenly. Then her infant son dies. Caterina is left alone on the throne, surrounded by enemies. Venice sends a fleet to protect our dear daughter, they say. They protect her so hard that they basically take over the administration of the island. For years they pressure her. You're tired, Caterina. It's hard work being a queen. Why don't you retire? Come home to Venice. We have a nice villa for you. Finally, in 1489, she breaks. She abdicates. She sails back to Venice. The Doge meets her on the Bucintero, the golden barge. It is a massive celebration. Welcome home, Queen of Cyprus. They set her up in a beautiful castle in the town of Asolo in the hills. She held a salon there, surrounded by artists and poets. It was a gilded cage. She was a queen without a kingdom, a living trophy. And Venice? Venice kept Cyprus. They kept the sugar plantations. They kept the taxes. They pulled off a hostile takeover of a sovereign nation using a marriage contract and a fleet of warships. It was cold, it was brilliant. So, as we reach the end of the 1400 s, Venice looks invincible. The Lion of St. Mark flies from the Alps to the island of Cyprus. The treasury is overflowing. The arsenal is churning out a ship a day. The printing presses are whirring. The parties are legendary. But if you know where to look, there is a storm cloud on the horizon. And this time, it's not an army, it's not a plague, it's a math problem. Venice's entire business model is based on being the middleman. You want pepper? You have to buy it from the Arabs in Alexandria, who brought it from India. Venice ships it to Europe and marks up the price by 500%. It's a monopoly based on geography, but in 1488, a Portuguese guy named Bartolomeu Dias sails around the bottom of Africa, and in 1492, a Genoese guy working for Spain, Christopher Columbus, bumps into the Americas, and in 1498, Vasco da Gama sails all the way to India. The news trickles back to the Rialto. At first, the Venetian bankers don't panic. They think, so what? It takes too long to sail around Africa. It's dangerous. The old route is still the best. They are in denial. They are Blockbuster Video, looking at Netflix and saying, people like the experience of coming to the store. They don't realize it yet, but the geography of the world has just shifted under their feet. The Mediterranean is about to become a lake. The Atlantic is the new ocean. The slow, agonizing death of the Venetian economy is about to begin. But it will be a beautiful death, a slow, golden sunset that lasts for 300 years. Because when you can't be the most powerful anymore, you can still be the most beautiful. As the 16th century dawns, Venice decides that if the world is ending, they are going to go out in style. They are going to hire Titian. They are going to hire Tintoretto. They are going to hire Palladio. They are going to build a stage set so magnificent that the world will keep coming to watch the play, even after the plot has lost its meaning. And that stage set began with a panic attack on the Rialto Bridge. It's 1499. A banker named Girolamo Priuli is standing in the market watching the prices on the chalkboard. For centuries the price of pepper was stable, high but stable. It was the gold standard. Then a ship arrives with news from Lisbon. The Portuguese have returned from India. They have spices, and they are selling them for a fraction, a literal fraction, of what Venice charges. Priuli goes home and writes in his diary. You can almost hear his hand shaking as he holds the quill. He writes, "This is the worst news that could ever arrive." He predicts that the grass will grow on the steps of the Rialto. He sees the end of the world because the math was brutal. Venice had to pay taxes to the Ottomans, pay for the overland caravans, pay the loading fees in Alexandria, and pay the captain. The Portuguese just had to sail around Africa. Sure, it took 6 months, and you might get scurvy, but there were no middlemen, no taxes. The Venetian monopoly, the engine that had built the marble palaces, had just blown a gasket. But Venice, being Venice, didn't collapse immediately. It had momentum. It had cash reserves. It was like a massive flywheel that keeps spinning even after you cut the power. However, just as the economy started to wobble, the neighbors smelled blood. Enter Pope Julius II. This guy wasn't your typical turn-the-other-cheek pontiff. He was the warrior pope. He wore armor. He led armies. He had a temper that could peel paint off the walls. And he absolutely hated Venice. Why? Because Venice was arrogant. They appointed their own bishops. They taxed the church. They held on to towns in the Romagna region that the Pope claimed were his. They treated the Vatican like a annoying HOA that they could ignore. So, in 1508, Julius II organized the League of Cambrai. This was the Avengers of 16th century Europe. But the villains, it was everyone: the King of France, Louis XVIII, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, the King of Spain, Ferdinand, and the Pope. They all got together in a secret room and signed a treaty with one goal: to carve Venice up like a Thanksgiving turkey. The Pope actually said, "I will reduce Venice to the status of a humble fishing village." This was an existential threat. Venice was facing the combined military might of the entire continent. The war started in 1509. The French army marched into northern Italy. The Venetian army, mercenaries mostly, marched out to meet them at a place called Agnadello. It was a slaughter. The Venetian army was annihilated in one afternoon. The mercenary captains ran away, and then the dominoes fell. All those mainland cities that Venice had conquered, Verona, Vicenza, Padua, they opened their gates to the invaders. The locals actually cheered. They hated the Venetian tax collectors. In 2 weeks, Venice lost an empire that had taken 100 years to build. They were pushed right back to the edge of the lagoon. The French were on the shores, looking across the water, probably measuring the drapes for the Doge's palace. Inside the city, it was mass hysteria. The Doge, Leonardo Loudon, was practically catatonic. People were burying their gold in gardens. They were packing boats to flee to, well, nowhere. There was nowhere left to go. But then the lagoon did its magic again. The water stopped the armies. Horses can't swim the gap. Cannons couldn't reach the city. Safe behind their moat, the Venetians took a breath, and then they did what they do best. They opened their checkbooks. They realized that the League of Cambrai was a fragile alliance. These kings didn't actually like each other, they just hated Venice. So, Venetian diplomats went to work. They went to the Pope. They said, "Your Holiness, we are so sorry. We were bad. Here are the keys to the towns you wanted. And, by the way, have you noticed that the French are getting really powerful in Italy? Do you really want the King of France living next door?" The Pope thought about it. He realized, yeah, I actually hate the French more than I hate the Venetians. He switched sides. Then Venice went to Spain. "Hey, Ferdinand, the French are trying to take Naples. You want to help us stop them?" Venice managed to flip the alliance. They turned their enemies against each other. It took 8 years of grinding, miserable warfare, but by 1517 they had won almost all their territory back. The Lion of St. Mark was back on the mainland. But something had changed. The confidence was gone. They realized they weren't invincible. They were a small fish in a tank with sharks. France and Spain and Wales, the Ottomans. So they turned inward. If they couldn't conquer the world militarily, they would conquer it aesthetically. This is the high noon of Venetian art. While the politicians were sweating bullets, the painters were creating masterpieces. Titian, Veronese, Tintoretto, these guys were the rock stars of the 1500s, and they invented a style that was uniquely Venetian. In Florence, art was about drawing perfect lines, anatomy, intellect. Michelangelo and Leonardo were obsessed with structure. In Venice, art was about color. It was about light. It was about the way velvet shimmers, the way a pearl glows, the way the sky looks when a storm is coming over the Adriatic. Why? Because of the environment. In Venice, the light is constantly changing, reflecting off the water. The outlines of things are blurry because of the humidity. So Venetian art became atmospheric, emotional, and sensual. Titian was the master of this. He used Venetian red. He painted women with loose hair and soft skin. He painted mythological orgies and pious Madonnas with the same brush. He lived to be roughly 1,000 years old, late 80s, which was ancient back then, and died rich, painting for kings and emperors who begged for his work. And Tintoretto was the punk rocker. His nickname was Il Furio. He painted fast with furious, slashed brushstrokes. He was a marketing genius. Once there was a competition to design a ceiling panel for a church. The other artists brought sketches. Tintoretto secretly climbed up the scaffolding the night before, painted the finished work on the ceiling, and unveiled it the next morning. When the judges complained, he said, "This is how I sketch." He got the job. This explosion of beauty was a coping mechanism. The city was partying on the edge of a volcano, and in the 1570s, the volcano erupted, but not with lava, with rats. The plague of 1575. Venice had dealt with plagues before. The Black Death in 1348 had wiped out half the city. But the outbreak of 1575 was particularly horrific because the city was so crowded. It started, as these things always do, with a denial. A few people died in the poorer districts. The magistrates said, "It's just a fever, don't panic, don't scare away the merchants." But then the numbers started climbing. 10 a day, 50, 100. The government instituted a total lockdown. They were the pioneers of quarantine. The word comes from quarenta garnoro, 40 days. They set up lazarettos islands in the lagoon specifically for the sick. If you had a fever, the plague doctors would come to your house. You know the look, the long black wax-coated coat, the leather gloves. and the beak mask filled with aromatic herbs, juniper, camphor, to filter out the miasma. They looked like terrifying giant birds. If you were diagnosed, they dragged you out. They put you on a boat to the Lazaretto Vecchio. The conditions on that island were hell on earth. Thousands of dying people crammed into warehouses, lying on straw, delirious, bleeding. The monks who tended them died just as fast. Back in the city, the silence was deafening. No church bells. They stopped ringing them because it was depressing to hear them all day. No street hawkers. Just the splash of the death boats collecting the bodies. By the time it burned out in 1577, 50,000 Venetians were dead, a third of the population. The Doge, Alvise Mocenigo, made a vow. He promised God that if the plague stopped, Venice would build the most magnificent church ever dedicated to the Redeemer. The plague stopped. They hired Andrea Palladio, the greatest architect of the age. He built Il Redentore, the Redeemer, on the island of Giudecca. It's a masterpiece of white marble, looking like a Roman temple floating on the water, and every year, on the third Sunday of July, the Venetians built a bridge of boats across the Giudecca Canal so the Doge could walk across and give thanks. They still do this today, the Festa del Redentore. It ends with massive fireworks, but remember that party started as a desperate plea to stop the dying. Just as the city was recovering from the plague, getting its population back, the Ottomans came knocking again. This time, they wanted Cyprus. We talked about how Venice stole Cyprus from Queen Caterina. Well, the Ottomans decided it was their turn. In 1570, they invaded. The Venetian garrison at Famagusta held out for months. The commander, Marcantonio Bragadin, was a hero. He surrendered only when they ran out of food and gunpowder, after the Ottoman commander promised them safe passage. The Ottoman commander lied. When Bragadin walked out, they seized him. They cut off his nose and ears. They flayed him alive, literally skinned him. They stuffed his skin with straw, sewed it back up, put it on a cow, and paraded it around. When news of this atrocity reached Venice, the city went cold with rage. It wasn't just business anymore. It was personal. Venice screamed for help. The Pope, Pius V, managed to cobble together a holy league. Spain, Venice, the Papal States, and the Knights of Malta. They assembled a massive fleet, over 200 galleys. On October 7, 1571, they met the Ottoman fleet at the Gulf of Lepanto in Greece. This was the Battle of Lepanto. It was the last great rowing battle in history. 400 ships, 140,000 men. A clash of floating cities. The Venetian contingent was led by Sébastien Venier. He was 75 years old. He was known for being cranky and difficult. During the battle, he didn't sit in the back. He stood on the deck of his flagship in his slippers because the deck was slippery with blood, firing a crossbow at the Turks. Venice had a secret weapon, the galeasse. These were 6 massive, converted merchant ships. They were higher than the galleys. They were packed with cannons on all sides. Usually galleys only had guns on the front. The Venetians towed these monsters to the front of the line. When the Ottoman fleet charged, the galleasses unleashed hell. They broke the Ottoman formation before the ships even touched. The battle turned into a chaotic, bloody scrum. Ships rammed each other, locking together to form wooden platforms. Marines fought hand-to-hand with swords and arquebuses. The sea literally turned red. Cervantes, the guy who wrote Don Quixote, was there. He got shot in the hand and lost the use of it. He later said he was proud to have lost his left hand for the glory of the right. By sunset, the Ottoman fleet was destroyed. The Holy League had captured 130 ships and sunk 50, and the French fleet, Florence and Thorns, cut the Cape. What happened? At the Fatandun, they freed 12,000 Christian slaves who were chained to the Ottoman oars. It was a total victory. When the news reached Venice, the city went insane. They rang every bell, they fired every cannon, they dragged the captured Ottoman flags through the streets. They thought, we did it, we saved Christendom, we saved the Mediterranean. But here comes the cynical reality check. What did Lepanto actually achieve? The Ottomans had vast resources, vast treasuries. Within 6 months, they had rebuilt their entire fleet. They joked to the Venetian ambassador, "By taking Cyprus, we cut off your arm. By defeating our fleet, you merely shaved our beard, and a beard grows back thicker." Venice, on the other hand, was exhausted. They couldn't afford to keep fighting. 2 years later, Venice secretly signed a peace treaty with the Sultan. They agreed to give up Cyprus. They agreed to pay a massive war indemnity. So, on paper, they won the battle of the century. In reality, they lost the war. This was the turning point, the realization that they could no longer be a superpower. They were too small. The world of nation-states' pain. France, England, the Ottoman Empire was too big for a single city to fight. So Venice made a conscious decision. If they couldn't be the warriors of Europe, they would be the playground of Europe. They began the shift toward the sensation economy, gambling, opera, prostitution, carnival. The 17th century, the 1600s, sees Venice transforming into a Baroque theatre. The architecture becomes more ornate, the statues get more dramatic, the music gets more complex. This is the era of Claudio Monteverdi. He becomes the director of music at St. Mark's. He essentially invents modern opera. Why? Because opera is the perfect Venetian art form. It's emotional, it's expensive, it's full of costumes and masks, and it's all about the drama. Venice opens the first public opera house in the world in 1637. Before this, opera was just for rich people in private palaces. Venice democratized it. Anyone with a ticket could go, and the tourists started coming. The Grand Tour was beginning. Young British aristocrats would travel to Italy to finish their education, which usually meant getting drunk in Venice and falling in love with a courtesan. But beneath the music and the parties, the rot was setting in. The nobility was shrinking. Families were dying out because they were too into bread, or too afraid to have too many children, didn't want to split the inheritance. The economy was stagnating. The port was silting up. The ships were getting older. And the government became obsessed with maintaining the illusion of power. The Council of Ten became even more secretive. They banned political discussions. You could talk about music. You could talk about women. You could talk about the weather, but if you talked about the decline of the Republic in a coffee shop, you disappeared. This creates the unique atmosphere of late Venice, a hedonistic party happening inside a police state. It's the 1600s. You are walking through the Piazza San Marco. It is teeming with people, Turks in turbans, Germans in furs, charlatans selling snake oil, puppet shows, bear baiting. You sit down at a new establishment that has just arrived from the east. A coffee. Coffee has hit Venice. The Venetians were the first Europeans to import it. At first the priests wanted to ban it as the devil's drink because the Muslims drank it, but the Pope tasted it and said, "This is too delicious to leave to the infidels. We shall baptize it." So now, coffee houses are popping up everywhere. The most famous, Café Florian, opens in 1720, but the culture starts earlier. These coffee houses became the living rooms of the city, but they were living rooms with ears. The state inquisitors had spies everywhere. One of the most fascinating figures of this era is a woman named Elena Cornaro Piscopia. She was the daughter of a nobleman and a peasant woman. She was a genius. She spoke 7 languages. She debated theology. In 1678 she applied to the University of Padua, Venice's university. The church said no, a woman, impossible. But Venice said, let her speak. She defended her thesis in the cathedral because the university hall was too small to hold a crowd. She spoke in brilliant Latin for an hour. She became the first woman in the history of the world to receive a PhD. It showed that Venice still had that spark, that intellectual fearlessness. They would break the rules if the person was exceptional enough. But exceptions don't save empires. As we move toward the 1700s, the shadows are getting longer. The Venetian navy is shrinking. They are losing their last islands in the Aegean, one by one, to the Ottomans. The city is becoming a museum of itself, a beautiful, golden, sinking museum. And into this decaying paradise steps the ultimate symbol of Venetian decline, a man whose name is synonymous with seduction, adventure, and the absolute refusal to grow up, Giacomo Casanova. He is born in 1725 to 2 actors. He is a nobody. But in 18th century Venice, if you have charm, a good mask, and no shame, you can be anybody. He will be our guide through the final, glittering, ridiculous century of the Republic, the party to end all parties. But before we meet Casanova, we have to endure the Baroque twilight, the long, slow, sweet slide into irrelevance. Imagine the city at night in 1690. The fog is thick. The only light comes from the oil lamps at the corners of the streets. Venice was the first city to install street lighting. The gondolas are black coffins sliding through the mist. The sound of violins drifts from the open windows of the palaces, playing Vivaldi, Antonio Vivaldi, the Red Priest. He's working at the Ospedale della Pietà, an orphanage for girls. He is teaching abandoned children to play the violin like angels. He is writing the 4 seasons. The music is frantic, virtuosic, and beautiful. It sounds like a storm. It sounds like a city that is trying to play loud, enough to drown out the sound of the rising water. Welcome to the Settecento, the 1700s. If the previous centuries were about building an empire, this century is about spending the inheritance. Venice has officially entered its trust fund kid phase. It is no longer a manufacturing powerhouse. It is no longer a military superpower. It is the pleasure capital of the Western world. It is the era of the mask. In the 18th century, the Venetian government allowed the wearing of masks for 6 months out of the year, from the first Sunday in October until Christmas, and then from Epiphany until Lent. Basically, for half your life, you could walk around with a plastic face, incognito. Imagine what that does to a society. It creates a world without consequences. A nobleman could beg for money in the street without shame. A priest could gamble his church's collection plate away at the card table. A housewife could have an affair right in front of her husband. This was the Venice of the Grand Tour. Rich young men from England, France, and Germany would travel to Italy to study the classics. That was the brochure pitch, anyway. In reality, they came to Venice to get drunk, gamble, and meet women. It was the study abroad program from hell, or heaven, depending on your perspective. And because Venice needed the money, they leaned into it. They became a service economy. They invented the tourist trap. There were guidebooks listing the best brothels and the prices of the courtesans. There were cicerones, guides, who would take you to see the paintings and then take you to the gambling dens. Speaking of gambling, let's talk about the Ridotto. The Ridotto was the first state-sanctioned casino in the world, opened in the Palazzo Dandolo. It was an incredible scene. The walls were covered in stamped leather and gold, the chandeliers were crystal, but the atmosphere was weirdly quiet. There was a strict rule: silence. You didn't cheer when you won, you didn't curse when you lost. The only voice allowed was the croupier, always a nobleman in a wig and a toga-like robe, announcing the card. Everyone except the nobles had to wear a mask. This was the great equalizer. You could be sitting next to a prince or a pauper, and you wouldn't know. Millions of ducats changed hands here, fortunes that had taken centuries to build from the spice trade, from the Crusades, were lost in a single night on a game called Faro. It was here, amidst the shuffling cards and the silent desperation, that we find Giacomo Casanova. Casanova is often remembered as just a great lover, a caricature of a seducer, but that sells him short. He was much more interesting than that. He was a mathematician, a spy, a violinist, a librarian, a scam artist, and a writer. He was the human embodiment of 18th century Venice, brilliant, beautiful, and completely morally bankrupt. He was a tall man, dark-skinned, charismatic. He could talk his way into and out of anything. He scammed a French aristocrat, Madame Duret, by convincing her he could help her be reborn as a boy using magic numbers. He founded a lottery in Paris. He argued with Voltaire. But in Venice, his behavior finally annoyed the wrong people. In 1755, the state inquisitors, the secret police, had had enough. They arrested him. The charges were vague: public irreligion, owning forbidden books, and generally being a nuisance to the social order. They threw him into the Piombi, the leads. We've mentioned the leads before, but let's go inside. These were special cells located directly under the lead-covered roof of the Doge's palace. In the summer, the sun beat down on the metal, turning the cells into an oven. The temperature could reach 120 degrees. In the winter, the lead conducted the cold, turning the cells into freezers. Casanova was locked in a cell with a ceiling so low he couldn't stand up. He was infested with fleas. He was 30 years old, in the prime of his life, and he was told he was there for 5 years. For a man like Casanova, who needed stimulation like oxygen, this was a death sentence. So he decided to do the impossible: break out of the Doge's palace. This escape story is one of the greatest real-life thrillers in history. He wrote about it in his memoirs, and while he probably exaggerated a bit, the mechanics of it are verified. First, he found a metal spike, a bolt from a door dropped by a careless guard. He sharpened it on a piece of black marble until it was a dagger. He started digging through the floorboards under his bed. He dug for weeks. He was almost through to the room below, which was the council chamber, when the jailers suddenly moved him to a different, better cell. Disaster. His hole was discovered in the old cell. The jailer, Lorenzo, was furious. He searched Casanova's new cell, but couldn't find the spike. Casanova had hidden it in the spine of a Bible. Now Casanova was watched constantly. He couldn't dig, so he came up with a new plan. He realized he had a neighbor in the cell next door, a disgraced priest named Father Balbi. They communicated by tapping on the walls and sending books back and forth. The jailer allowed them to swap reading material. Casanova hid the spike in a large Bible and sent it to Balbi with a plate of pasta on top to hide the weight. He told Balbi, "Dig a hole in your ceiling, then climb across and dig a hole in my ceiling." It took weeks. Balbi was lazy and complained constantly. Casanova had to coach him through the wall like a personal trainer. "Keep digging, father, faster." On the night of October 31, 1756, Halloween, appropriately, Balbi broke through. He dropped into Casanova's cell, but they weren't out yet. They were just out of the cells. They were now in the attic space between the cells and the roof. They cut their way through the lead tiles of the roof. Now imagine this. It's midnight. There is a thick fog, classic Venice. Casanova and a fat, terrified monk are crawling on the slippery, pitched lead roof of the Doge's palace, hundreds of feet above the stone pavement of the Piazza San Marco. If they slip, they are tomato paste. They crawl to a dormer window, it's barred. They manage to break the grating, but it's a long drop down into the palace. They use their bed sheets, torn into ropes, to lower themselves in. They land in a room inside the palace. They are exhausted. Casanova, with nerves of steel, decides to take a nap, literally. He sleeps for an hour to regain his strength. Balbi thinks he's insane. They wake up and start trying to unlock the doors from the inside. They pick the locks. They wander through the opulent, empty halls of the government, the very rooms where the Council of 10 sentence people to death. They are wearing tattered, dirty clothes, covered in roof dust and blood. They reach the Scala d'Oro, the golden staircase, the ceremonial entrance. The main gate is locked. They are stuck. It's getting light. People are starting to wake up. Casanova spots a window looking out onto the courtyard. He casually leans out and spots a gatekeeper. He waves. The gatekeeper looks up. He sees a man in the palace. He assumes it's a politician or a VIP who got locked in by mistake after a late meeting. He runs to open the heavy gates. Casanova and Balbi walk down the stairs. They walk past the gatekeeper. They walk out the door of the Doge's palace. They don't run. Running attracts attention. They walk briskly to the dock. Casanova hails a gondola. "I want to go to Mestre," he tells the gondolier. He throws himself onto the cushions. As the gondola pulls away, he looks back at the palace, the prison that tried to break him. He is free. He goes to Paris, becomes a celebrity, and tells the story at dinner parties for the rest of his life. This escape captures the spirit of the age. The government was scary, yes, but it was also incompetent. It was rotting from the inside. The gatekeeper opened the door because he couldn't imagine anyone defying the system. While Casanova was running, another Venetian was capturing the city's image for the world. Giovanni Antonio Canal, known as Canaletto. You've seen his paintings. Those crisp, wide-angle views of the Grand Canal, the blue sky, the green water, the little people in three-cornered hats. Canaletto was a commercial genius. He realized that the rich British tourists wanted a souvenir to take home, a postcard. But since photography didn't exist, they bought paintings. He set up a studio that was basically a factory. He used a camera obscura device that projects an image onto a canvas using lenses and mirrors to trace the outlines of the buildings. That's why his perspective is so perfect, almost photorealistic. He painted the Venice that the tourists wanted to see. He brightened the water. He cleaned up the trash. He made the light look like perpetual golden hour. He was selling a fantasy, but if you look closely at the art of the time, especially the paintings of Francesco Guardi, Canaletto's rival, you see the truth. Guardi's paintings are mistier, sadder. The buildings look a bit crumbled. The water looks dark. He was painting the decay. Because the decay was getting hard to hide, the economy was broken, the aristocracy was fracturing into two groups, the super-rich, who owned all the land, and the Barnabotti. The Barnabotti were a tragic class of poor nobles. They lived in the parish of San Barnaba, hence the name. Because they were nobles, Venetian law forbade them from doing manual labor. They couldn't be merchants, they couldn't be craftsmen, that was beneath them. But they had no money. Their families had lost their fortunes centuries ago. So you had these men living in slums, wearing silk robes that were falling apart, begging for a government stipend. They were angry, useless, and humiliated. They spent their days gambling in the ridotto, often with borrowed money, or selling their votes in the Great Council to the highest bidder. The political system had become paralyzed. The Council of Ten was terrified of change. They had a motto, dura lex sed lex. The law is harsh, but it is the law. They refused to reform. They refused to modernize the army. They refused to update the trade laws. They just wanted the party to keep going. There is a story that sums up this denial. In the late 1700s, an admiral warned the Doge that the fleet was in terrible shape. The ships were rotting. The cannons were rusted. The Doge replied, "My dear Admiral, if we have no ships, we cannot be dragged into a war. Our weakness is our defense." It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off. Spoiler, it doesn't. Because while Venice was dancing the minuet and eating frittelle, the world outside was exploding. The Enlightenment was happening. Men like Voltaire and Rousseau were writing about rights of man and liberty. They were saying that kings and doges and aristocrats were obsolete. And then, in 1789, the French Revolution kicked the door down. The Venetians watched the news from Paris with horror. They saw the French king and queen get their heads chopped off. They saw the aristocracy being hunted. The Venetian government went into lockdown mode. They banned French newspapers. They banned the word liberty. They pretended that if they just ignored it, the revolution would go away. But the revolution had an exporter, a young, short, very ambitious general named Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1796, Napoleon invaded Italy. He swept through the Austrians. He was a force of nature. He moved faster than any army in history. He didn't care about the old rules of war. He stood on the edge of the Venetian mainland territory. Venice declared unarmed neutrality. It sounds like a joke, and it kind of was. They basically said, "Hey, we aren't involved. We don't have an army. Please don't hurt us." Napoleon looked at Venice and didn't see a glorious ancient republic. He saw a dusty, corrupt antique shop. He saw a bank account he could loot to pay his soldiers. He said, "I will be an Attila to the state of Venice." That's a callback. Remember Attila? The guy who caused the founding of the city 1,300 years earlier. Now, a new Attila had arrived to close the book. The end came in May 1797. It was pathetic. There was no siege. There was no heroic last stand. There was no Battle of the Golden Horn. Napoleon was camped on the mainland. He sent a message. Change your government, democratize, or I destroy you. The Great Council met for the last time on May 12, 1797. It was a Sunday. The Doge was Ludovico Manin. He was a weak man, the first Doge from a new money family. He sat on the throne, pale and shaking. There were 537 nobles present. Outside they could hear the sound of cannon fire. It was actually just the Venetian troops firing a salute, but the terrified nobles thought Napoleon was attacking. The Doge stood up. He held the corno, the ducal cap, in his hands. He said, with tears in his eyes, "We are not safe even in this bed." He proposed a resolution to abdicate, to dissolve the Republic of Venice, to hand the city over to the French. They voted 512 to 20. They voted to commit suicide. The Doge took off the cap. He handed it to his servant and said one of the saddest lines in history, "Take it away, I shall not be needing it again." They went out onto the balcony of the Doge's palace and announced the end of the Republic. They shouted, "Viva la libertà!" trying to suck up to the French. The crowd in the square, the common people, the gondoliers, the arsenal workers, were confused. They started shouting, "Viva San Marco!" They wanted to fight. They wanted to defend their lion. They loved the old Republic, even with its flaws. But the nobles were too scared. They opened the gates. On May 15th, 1797, French troops marched into the Piazza San Marco. They weren't tourists. They were conquerors. The 1,100-year-old republic was dead. The oldest government in existence was gone. And then the looting began. But this wasn't the fun looting of Constantinople where Venice got to take the stuff. This was Venice getting looted. Napoleon didn't care about the romance. He wanted the cash. He took the contents of the arsenal. He took the gold from the mint. He melted down the Doge's crown. He took the Bucintoro, the magnificent golden barge, and burned it, just to extract the gold leaf from the wood. And then he looked at the basilica. He looked at the 4 bronze horses, the horses that Venice had stolen from Constantinople in 1204. Napoleon grinned. "Those will look great in Paris." He took them down. He crated them up. He shipped them to France to put on top of a triumphal arch. Karma is a slow grinder, but it grinds exceedingly fine. But Napoleon wasn't done insulting Venice. He didn't even want to keep the city. He just used it as a bargaining chip. Later that year, he signed the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria. He traded Venice to the Austrian Empire in exchange for Belgium and some land in Milan. Venice was bartered like a used car. The French left and the Austrians marched in. The double-headed eagle replaced the lion. The party was over. The lights were turned on, the music stopped, and the hangover began. For the next 60 years, Venice would be a ghost town, an occupied territory, a melancholy ruin ruled by bureaucrats from Vienna. But ruins are romantic, and as the 19th century begins, a new kind of person starts arriving. Not the gambler, not the merchant, but the poet, the romantic. Lord Byron, Shelley, Wagner. They come because it is dead. They come to weep over the beauty of the corpse. Venice is about to invent its final, and perhaps most enduring industry, nostalgia. So let's sit on a damp stone bench in the year 1816 and look at what remains of the party. The music has stopped. The gold barge is burnt. The Doge is dead. The Austrians are in charge, and they are, to put it mildly, buzzkills. They are efficient bureaucrats who like filing systems, early bedtimes and waltzes. They look at Venice, this labyrinth of crumbling decadence, and they just want to tidy it up. The city is silent. Not the peaceful quiet of a library, but the silence of a tomb. The population has crashed. The great families are broke. They are stripping the lead off their own roofs to sell for scrap. They are renting out the ground floors of their palazzos to cobblers and blacksmiths. If you walked into a random palace in 1820, you wouldn't see a masked ball. You'd see a family huddling in one room around a stove, while the frescoes in the hallway peeled off the walls from the humidity. It was shabby chic before that was a marketing term. It was just shabby. And it was this specific quality, this tragic, beautiful, moulding decay, that attracted the world's first celebrity influencer, Lord Byron. George Gordon Byron, he was the rock star of the 19th century, bad, mad, and dangerous to know. He was fleeing a divorce scandal in England and rumours of incest and debt and general chaos, and he decided Venice was the only place broken enough to match his soul. He arrived in 1816 and moved into the Palazzo Mocenigo on the Grand Canal, and he didn't just rent it, he turned it into a menagerie. Byron's roommates included 2 monkeys, a fox, a wolf, several dogs, and a peacock. Imagine being the landlord doing the inspection. The peacock would scream at night, the monkeys would throw fruit at the gondoliers, and Byron would be upstairs writing Don Juan or sleeping with the baker's wife. He treated the city like his personal gym. He was obsessed with swimming. One time, after a night of heavy drinking, he bet a friend he could swim from the Lido, the barrier island, all the way to the end of the Grand Canal. That's about 4 miles. Against the tide. He did it. He spent 4 hours in that filthy water, dodging gondolas and floating debris, and he emerged at the end triumphant and probably smelling absolutely terrible. But Byron did something more important than just act out. He rebranded the city. He wrote the 4th canto of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage about Venice. He described it as the greenest isle of my imagination. He wrote about the Bridge of Sighs. Now, here is a fun fact. Before Byron, nobody cared about that bridge. It was just a covered corridor connecting the court to the prison. It was functional architecture. Byron gave it the name Bridge of Sighs, Ponte dei Sospiri, imagining the prisoners sighing as they took their last look at Venice through the tiny stone grills. It was pure poetic invention. Most prisoners crossing that bridge were petty thieves going to a holding cell, not doomed heroes. But the tourists ate it up. They still do. Every time you see a couple kissing under that bridge today, they are reenacting a marketing campaign launched by a British poet in 1818. Byron made sadness sexy. He made it cool to come to Venice and weep over the fallen greatness. And following Byron came a whole wave of British intellectuals. The most intense of them was John Ruskin. Ruskin was an art critic, but that word doesn't do him justice. He was an obsessive. He arrived in the mid-19th century and saw the Austrians renovating the old buildings. They were knocking down medieval arches and putting up gas lamps. Ruskin was horrified. He believed that the stones of Venice were sacred text. He spent his days on a ladder, measuring the spacing of windows in the Doge's palace, sketching the curve of every arch, counting the bricks. He wrote The Stones of Venice, a massive 3-volume book that basically argued that Gothic architecture was moral and good, and Renaissance architecture, the later stuff, was arrogant and godless. He hated the Rialto Bridge, he called it ignoble. He hated the perfectly symmetrical churches of Palio. He wanted the weird, irregular, moss-covered medieval stuff. Ruskin is the reason we preserve Venice today. He told the Victorians, "This place is vanishing. Look at it now, before it sinks." He turned tourism into a moral duty. You weren't just on vacation, you were witnessing the last gasps of a civilization. But while Ruskin was measuring bricks, the Austrians were actually doing something that would change Venice more than any poet. They were looking at the map and thinking, this boat commute is ridiculous. The Austrians were obsessed with trains. They were building railways all over their empire, and they decided to do the unthinkable, connect Venice to the mainland. In 1841 they started driving piles, not wood this time, but thousands of them, across 2 miles of open lagoon. They built the Ponte della Libertà, though they called it something else then. In 1846 the first steam train chugged across the water and pulled into the new Santa Lucia station. This moment is profound. For 1,300 years, Venice had been an island. To get there, you had to leave the solid earth, get on a boat, and surrender yourself to the water. It was a psychological break. You were entering a different world. Now you could take a train from Vienna and step onto a platform in Venice without getting your shoes wet. It tethered the floating city to the real world. It became a terminus. The silence was broken by the whistle of the steam engine. But the Venetians weren't just watching trains. They were watching the rest of Europe. It was 1848, the year of revolutions. France was revolting, Hungary was revolting, and in Venice a lawyer named Daniele Manin stood up. Manin is a fascinating hero. He was half Jewish. His grandfather had converted, a distinct outsider to the old noble families. He was an intellectual, a nerd with glasses. But he had fire. He led a crowd to the arsenal. They intimidated the Austrian commander. The workers, the Arsenionotti, the descendants of the men who built the ships for Lepanto, grabbed wrenches and hammers. They beat the Austrian garrison into submission. Manin declared the Republic of San Marco. He stood on a table in the piazza and shouted, "We are free!" For a brief, shining moment, Venice was independent again. The Austrians retreated to the mainland. But empires don't like losing real estate. The Austrian field marshal, Radetzky, the guy the Strauss March is named after, regrouped. He surrounded the city. This was the siege of 1849, and it introduced a terrifying new technology. The Austrians couldn't get their cannons close enough to hit the center of the city because of the lagoon. So, an Austrian artillery officer named Franz von Uschetes had a crazy idea. What if we use balloons? They made hot air balloons out of paper and canvas. They attached bombs with timed fuses, slow-burning charcoal cords. They calculated the wind speed. On July 12, 1849, they launched the first aerial bombardment in human history. The Venetians looked up and saw these silent, ominous orbs floating over the lagoon. It must have looked like alien warfare. But as usual, the lagoon defended its own. The wind changed. Most of the balloons blew back over the Austrian lines. The bombs dropped on the besiegers. The Venetians cheered and jeered from the rooftops. But you can't fight hunger with cheers. The Austrians blocked the food supplies. Then the cholera arrived. Cholera is a horrific way to die. It hits fast. Dehydration, cramps, blue skin. In the crowded, starving city, it spread like wildfire. Manin tried to keep morale up, but by August 1849, the city was broken. They had no bread, they had no gunpowder, they surrendered. Manin went into exile, the Austrians marched back in, the silence returned. But the 19th century wasn't all gloom. In the later half, Venice began to pivot toward its modern identity, the luxury hotel. In 1866, thanks to a war between Prussia and Austria, Venice was finally handed over to the new Kingdom of Italy. The Italian king, Victor Emmanuel II, arrived on the royal barge. The Italian flag, green, white and red, was raised on the flagpoles of St. Mark's. Venice was Italian. But honestly, it felt weird. Venice had never been Italian. It had been Venetian. It was like New York suddenly becoming part of Texas. They spoke a different dialect. They had different customs. The new Italian government didn't really know what to do with Venice. It wasn't an industrial hub like Milan. It wasn't a political capital like Rome. So they leaned fully into tourism. They looked at the Lido. For centuries the Lido was a desolate strip of sand dunes where they executed criminals and where Byron rode his horses. Investors saw the beach. Sea bathing was the new health craze. Doctors prescribed taking the waters for everything from nerves to tuberculosis. These weren't converted palaces. These were massive, purpose-built luxury resorts. Looking out over the Adriatic, this is the era of death in Venice. Imagine the scene around 1900. The Lido is packed with cabanas. Aristocrats in full-body wool swimsuits are being wheeled into the ocean in little carts so they don't have to walk on the sand. Inside the Hotel de Bain, the dining room is silent and elegant. You have Russian princes, German barons, American heiresses. They are eating soup and ignoring the fact that the world is about to end again. World War I is coming. Gustav von Aschenbach, the protagonist of Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, sits there watching the boy Tadzio, obsessed with beauty, while a cholera epidemic, a callback to 1849, secretly sweeps the city. It captures the mood perfectly. Beauty and death, they are the twin patron saints of modern Venice. But while the rich were sunbathing on the Lido, the city itself was struggling with a new enemy. Not Austrians, not French, not plague, physics. On the morning of July 14, 1902, the unthinkable happened. The Campanile, the massive bell tower that stands in St. Mark's Square, had been acting weird. There was a crack in the side. The local coffee shop owner had warned the authorities, "Hey, the crack is getting bigger." The authorities did what authorities do. They formed a committee. They debated. On that Monday morning, a porter opened the doors to the belfry. He saw dust falling. At 9:45 a.m., the giant brick tower, which had stood for 1,000 years, mostly, gave a groan. It didn't tip over like a tree. It telescoped. It just sat down. It collapsed into a massive pile of red dust and rubble. Miraculously, nobody died. The only casualty was the caretaker's cat, who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. RIP. The collapse of the Campanile was a psychological shock. The tower was the anchor of the city. It was the finger pointing to God. If that could fall, anything could fall. The debate started immediately. Should we build something new, something modern? The city council said no. They coined a phrase that became the motto of Venetian restoration. Com'era, dov'era. How it was, where it was. They rebuilt it exactly as it had been. Fake antique, a copy of itself. This decision defined the 20th century for Venice. They decided that they would not evolve. They would not build skyscrapers. They would not modernize the skyline. They would freeze time. Venice became a curated exhibit. As the 20th century rolled on, the curated exhibit began to attract a new kind of patron, the art world. In 1895, the city founded the Biennale. They decided to host an international art exhibition in the Giardini, the public gardens created by Napoleon. They built pavilions for different countries. This was brilliant. It brought the avant-garde to the old city. Every 2 years, the weirdest, most modern art in the world descends on the most ancient city. It creates a fantastic contrast. You walk past a 15th century church and step into a white box where someone is screaming into a microphone while covered in chocolate. It keeps the city intellectually alive. It prevents it from just being Disneyland. But the biggest change in the late 19th and early 20th century was the water itself. Industrialization had arrived on the mainland at a place called Marghera. They dredged deep channels across the lagoon so oil tankers could reach the refineries. These channels changed the hydrodynamics of the lagoon. The water moved faster, the tides got higher. The acqua alta, high water, started becoming more frequent. In the old days, St. Mark's Square flooded maybe a few times a year. Now, it was happening all winter. The city was sinking, literally. They were pumping groundwater out from under the mainland for the factories, which caused the bedrock of the lagoon to deflate like a punctured tire. Venice was drowning in slow motion. But before we get to the modern struggle for survival, we have to look at one last eccentric figure who defined the early 20th century in Venice. Peggy Guggenheim. She was an American heiress, a collector of surrealist and abstract art. She arrived in Venice in the late 1940s, after World War II. She bought an unfinished palace on the Grand Canal, the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni. It's the one that looks like a stump because they only built the first floor. She lived there with her dogs, Lhasa Apsos, dozens of them, and her Jackson Pollock paintings. She would ride around in a private gondola, wearing crazy butterfly sunglasses, holding her little dogs. She was the last dogeress. She was the link between the decadent past and the modern art world. She is buried in the garden of her palace, next to her dogs. You can visit them, though here we are standing on the edge of the modern era. The Austrians are gone, the kings are gone, the city is Italian, but it belongs to the world. It is fragile, it is sinking, it is overrun with tourists, but it is still there. In the next part, we are going to look at the catastrophes of the 20th century, the 1966 flood that almost wiped the city off the map, the kidnapping of the city by mass tourism, and the desperate sci-fi engineering project designed to save it. We are going to ask the question, can a city built on wood and mud survive the era of climate change? Or is Venice destined to become the new Atlantis? November 4th, 1966. If you talk to any Venetian over the age of 70, they don't talk about the moon landing or the fall of the Berlin Wall. They talk about the Acqua Grande, the Great Water. It started like a normal Acqua Alta. The sirens wailed, that eerie rising and falling mechanical moan that echoes across the lagoon to warn of high tide. The shopkeepers did the routine drill, put the metal barriers, the pareti, in the doorways, put the expensive goods on the top shelf, and put on the rubber boots. But the wind didn't stop. A massive Scirocco storm, the hot, humid wind from North Africa was blasting up the Adriatic Sea. It was pushing a wall of water ahead of it, straight into the Venetian lagoon. At the same time, the atmospheric pressure dropped, sucking the water level even higher, and, because the universe has a dark sense of humor, the rivers on the mainland were flooding from heavy rains, pouring fresh water into the back of the lagoon. Venice was being attacked from both sides. The water kept rising. It didn't stop at the usual 110 centimeters. It went to 140, then 160, then 194 centimeters. That's 6 feet and 4 inches above the average sea level. Imagine standing in St. Mark's Square. The water isn't ankle deep, it's over your head. The lights go out, the electricity grid shorts, the phones go dead. But the horror wasn't just the water, it was the oil. In the basements of all those palazzos and hotels were heating oil tanks for the winter. The pressure of the floodwater smashed them. The oil leaked out, mixing with the sewage and the lagoon mud, to create a thick, black, toxic sludge. It coated everything. It ruined the frescoes low on the walls. It seeped into the porous brick. It destroyed millions of dollars worth of books in the National Library. For 24 hours, Venice was cut off from the world. No trains, no boats could navigate the violent waves in the lagoon. The people were trapped in the upper floors of their dark, freezing houses, listening to the water smashing against the doors below, wondering if the foundations would finally give way and the whole city would slide into the mud. When the water finally receded, it left behind a city painted black. This was the wake-up call. The Aqua Grande shouted to the world, "Venice is dying." It triggered a global panic. UNESCO stepped in. The British formed Venice in Peril. The Americans formed Save Venice. Millions of dollars in donations poured in to restore the art, clean the stone, and fix the roofs. But while the foreigners were saving the art, the locals were leaving. This is the silent tragedy of modern Venice, the Exodus. In 1951, the population of the historic city was about 175,000. It was a bustling, crowded, working-class city. Today, it's under 50,000. It wasn't a plague that drove them out. It was inconvenience and economics. After the 1966 flood, living on the ground floor became impossible. The damp was constant. The plaster would rot off the walls 6 months after you painted it. And then the cost of living exploded. If you own a building in Venice, you can rent it to a local family for €800 a month, or you can put it on Airbnb for €200 a night. Do the math. The butcher shops turned into mask shops. The bakeries turned into glass trinket stores. The hardware stores disappeared because tourists don't need hammers, they need gelato. Venice became a victim of its own beauty. It became a monoculture of tourism. By the 1990s and 2000s, this reached a fever pitch. The cruise ships arrived. These weren't the elegant liners of the 1920s. These were floating apartment blocks, massive white behemoths, 12 stories high, carrying 4,000 passengers. To get to the cruise terminal, they had to sail down the Giudecca Canal, right past St. Mark's Square. The visual was dystopian. You'd be standing on the piazzetta looking at the delicate, lace-like architecture of the Doge's palace, and suddenly the sun would be blocked out. A wall of white steel would glide past, towering over the bell tower. You could look up and see people on the upper deck eating buffet lunch, looking down at the city like it was a model village. The displacement of water from these ships eroded the foundations of the city. The pollution was intense. The vibrations cracked the stone. The locals fought back. The no grandi navi, no big ships movement started protesting. They took their little fishing boats and blocked the channel, buzzing around the giant cruisers like angry mosquitoes. Finally, in 2021, the Italian government banned the big ships from entering the historic center. They now have to dock at an industrial port further away. It was a victory, but a small one. The tourists still come, they just take a longer bus ride. But the biggest existential threat remained, the water itself. Climate change means rising sea levels. Venice is sinking while the ocean is rising. It's a bad combination. So, Italy decided to build a wall, or rather, a gate. Project MOSE. MOSE stands for Modulo Experimentale, electromechanical module. It's also a play on the name Moses, the guy who parted the Red Sea. The engineering concept is actually brilliant. You can't build a permanent wall across the lagoon inlets because you need the tides to flush out the sewage. Remember, Venice still doesn't have a real sewer system. The tide is the plumber. If you block the tide, the lagoon dies and turns into a stagnant swamp. So they designed mobile gates. Imagine a row of massive, yellow metal boxes filled with water, sitting flat on the bottom of the sea at the three inlets, Lido, Malamocco, Caija. They are invisible from the surface. When a high tide is forecast, over 110 cm, they pump compressed air into the boxes. The water is pushed out, the boxes become buoyant. They swing up on giant hinges and rise to the surface, forming a barrier, a temporary dam. It sounds great on paper. In reality, it became the biggest corruption scandal in modern Italian history. Construction started in 2003. It was supposed to be finished by 2011. It cost billions, but the money kept disappearing. In 2014, the police arrested the mayor of Venice, Giorgio Orsoni, and 35 others. They uncovered a system of bribes, kickbacks, and false invoicing that would have made the old Doge proud. They were funneling millions of euros into political campaigns and Swiss bank accounts. The project stalled. The yellow gates sat underwater, rusting. The hinges corroded. The mold grew. Venice watched in cynicism. "It will never work," they said. "It's a robbery." Then came November 2019, another Acqua Granda, the second highest tide in history, 187 p.m. The council hadn't activated MOSE because it wasn't ready. The city drowned again. The damage was catastrophic. The crypt of St. Mark's flooded. The corrosive salt water ate into the marble columns. The anger was palpable. We spent €6 billion for a system that doesn't work. Under immense pressure, they accelerated the testing. On October 3, 2020, a high tide was forecast. The sirens wailed. The shopkeepers got their boots ready, but then the yellow gates rose. They broke the surface of the grey water like a row of yellow teeth. Inside the lagoon, the water stayed calm. Outside, the Adriatic raged. It worked. St. Mark's Square remained dry. The shopkeepers looked at the dry pavement in disbelief. People were crying. MOSE is now operational. It saves the city from the big floods. But it's not a silver bullet. There are problems. First, it's expensive to run. Every time they lift the gates, it costs about €300,000 in electricity and labour. Second, the chronic flooding. St. Mark's Square is the lowest point in the city. It floods at just 80 cms MOSE, only activates at 110 cm. So the square still floods dozens of times a year. slowly rotting the basilica. Third, the ecosystem. If you keep closing the gates, you stop the oxygen exchange. The lagoon begins to suffocate. And finally, the terrifying long-term math. If sea levels rise by 50 centimeters due to melting ice caps, Moes will have to be closed all the time. If it's closed all the time, the port closes. The sewage doesn't flush. The lagoon becomes a septic tank. Moes is a band-aid, a very expensive, high-tech band-aid on a gushing wound. But let's step away from the engineering for a moment and look at the city today in the 2020s. If you go to Venice in July, it feels like a theme park. The streets are gridlocked with people following umbrellas. The noise is overwhelming. You can't see the city, you just see the backs of other tourists' heads. But here is the secret, the Venetian secret that the locals know. Wait until 11 o'clock p.m. The day trippers have gone back to the mainland. The cruise ship passengers are back on their boats. The souvenir shops are closed. Walk out into the city then. The silence returns. The ancient, heavy silence. The water laps against the stones. Slap, slap, slap. The fog rolls in. You walk through a campo, and you are the only person there. The street lights reflect off the wet paving stones. You pass a bakery that is working the night shift, and the smell of fresh bread hits you, mixing with the smell of the salt. In these moments, Venice is still there. The ghost is alive. You can see the layers of history peeling off the walls. You can imagine Casanova running around that corner. You can imagine Vivaldi hearing a melody in the wind. And there is a new kind of resident now, the students. Venice is a university city. Ca' Foscari University is one of the best in Italy. Thousands of young people live here. They sit in the Campo Santa Margherita, drinking spritz, the orange aperitif that is the fuel of Venice, smoking, arguing about politics. They are the heartbeat. They are the proof that it's not just a museum, but it's a fragile existence. Every Venetian lives with the knowledge that their city is temporary. There is a Japanese concept called mono no aware, the pathos of things, the appreciation of beauty, because it is impermanent. Cherry blossoms are beautiful because they fall. Venice is the urban equivalent of cherry blossoms. It is beautiful because it is impossible. It is beautiful because we know deep down that one day the water will win. One day the piles will rot, the brick will dissolve, the sea will reclaim the Rialto. But not yet. The Venetians are stubborn. They are the descendants of refugees who refused to be pushed into the sea by Attila the Hun. They refused to be conquered by Charlemagne. They refused to bow to the Pope. They are not going to give up just because the water is a little higher. There is a grim determination in the way a Venetian puts on their rubber boots to go get a coffee. It's a daily act of defiance. So, as we approach the end of our story, we have to look at the soul of the city. What is Venice? Is it a tourist trap? A sinking ruin? A warning about climate change? Or is it something else? A mirror. A mirror that reflects our own mortality. We look at Venice and we see our own fragility. We see that everything we build, no matter how grand, how gold-plated, how marble-carved, eventually has to negotiate with nature. It's the most human city on earth because it is the most vulnerable. In the final part, we're going to take a last walk. We're going to go to the places the tourists don't go. We're going to visit the island of the dead. We're going to look at the future. And we're going to say goodnight to the Serene Republic. So let's take that walk. We've spent hours talking about wars and commerce and stolen saints and sinking foundations. But to truly understand Venice before we say goodbye, you have to see it when the curtain comes down. You have to see it when the show is over. We are going to take a boat ride to the one place in the lagoon where the silence is absolute. It's an island just a few minutes north of the city, enclosed by high, red brick walls. From the outside it looks like a fortress. From the inside it is a garden. San Michele, the island of the dead. Since the time of Napoleon, who, in his typical, efficient manner, decided that burying people under church floorboards was unhygienic, this has been the city's cemetery. It's a city within a city. It has its own streets lined with cypress trees. These trees stand like tall, dark green candles, pointing straight up at the sky. They don't move in the wind, they just watch. Being dead in Venice is complicated. There is no space. The island is full. So the lease on a grave is temporary. You get 10 or 12 years. After that, unless you're famous or very rich, they dig you up, move your bones to a communal ossuary, and make room for the next tenant. Even in death, Venice is a rental market. But walking here, among the white marble tombs, you feel a profound sense of peace. You can hear the gravel crunching under your shoes. You can hear the distant hum of a vaporetto engine. Here lies Igor Stravinsky, the composer. Here lies Ezra Pound, the poet. Here lies Joseph Brodsky, the writer who said that Venice is eternity's hostage. They all came here because Venice offers the perfect backdrop for the end of things. It is a place that understands fading. Let's get back on the boat. We're going further north now, past the glass furnaces of Murano, deeper into the native lagoon. The water here is different. It's flatter. The channels wind through vast marshes of sea lavender and reeds. You see birds, herons, egrets, standing perfectly still on one leg, watching the water. We are heading to Torcello. This is where it all began, remember? Back in part 1. This was the bustling metropolis when Venice was just mud. It had palaces, 20,000 people, a mighty bishop. Now it has maybe 10 permanent residents. It is a ghost town, but a gentle one. The palaces were cannibalized centuries ago to build the city of Venice. The stones were taken away. The people left. All that remains is the massive cathedral of Santa Maria Assunto, standing alone in a field of tall grass. It looks like a spaceship that landed in a farm. Inside, there is a mosaic of the Last Judgment that covers the entire west wall. It is terrifying and beautiful. Skulls, demons, angels. It was made by Byzantine artists 1,000 years ago to scare the locals into being good. Now it just stares at empty pews. Torcello is the future of Venice. It is what happens when the tide finally wins. The stone returns to the earth. The noise fades. The grass grows over the piazza. And you know what? It's not sad. It's peaceful. It's the silence of a long Sunday afternoon. Let's turn the boat back. Let's head back toward the main city for one last look. It's late now. The moon is up. A full moon hanging over the Adriatic like a silver coin. We glide into the northern part of the city, the district called Cannaregio. This is where the locals live. The canals are narrower here, the bridges are lower. We cut the engine, we drift, listen to the water. In the daytime, the water is churned up by propellers, angry and chaotic. At night it settles, it becomes a mirror. You can see the reflection of the street lamps, those wrought iron lanterns, casting a warm yellow glow dancing on the black surface. The water laps against the brickwork of the houses. Slap, slap, slap. It's a rhythmic, hypnotic heartbeat. Look at the walls of the buildings as we drift past. They aren't straight. They bulge. They lean. They are covered in scars. You can see where a window was bricked up 300 years ago. You can see the metal tie rods, the iron staples holding the walls together. It's a city held together by tension and memory. You smell the air, it's specific. It's a mix of salt, wet stone, and jasmine from a hidden garden over a wall. It's a heavy air, it feels like a blanket. We drift under a bridge. Our footsteps echo as we get out and walk. We are in the ghetto. This was the first ghetto in the world, the place where the Jewish population was forced to live in the 16th century. The buildings are taller here, 7 or 8 stories, because they couldn't expand outward, so they built upward, skyscrapers of the Renaissance. It is quiet now, the shutters are closed, but you can feel the density of the lives lived here, the merchants, the scholars, the families. The layers of history are so thick you can almost touch them. We walk towards the Grand Canal. The palaces loom up in the dark. The Ca d'Oro, the Ca Rezonico, the Palazzo Grassi. Dark windows. Who lives there? A billionaire? A foundation? A ghost? At night the masks come off. The city isn't performing for anyone. It's just resting. We find a spot on a wooden dock, the Zeteri, facing south across the Giudecca Canal. The water is wide here. The wind is cool. There is a reason why Venice is the perfect bedtime story. It's because the city itself is a dream state. Think about it. In a normal city, you have cars. You have rigid lines. You have the hard reality of asphalt and concrete. In Venice, the ground moves. The streets are fluid. The light plays tricks on you. Reflections look real. Reality looks like a reflection. It is a place where the logic of the waking world doesn't apply. You can get lost in a circle. You can walk down a street and have it end abruptly in water. You are forced to surrender control. You are forced to float. And that is what sleep is. Surrendering control. Letting the current take you. Venice teaches us that it's okay to sink a little. It's okay to be heavy. It's okay to let the tides wash over you. The anxiety of the end, the fear that the city will drown slowly, fades away in the moonlight. You realize that Venice has been dying for 1,000 years. It's really good at it. It's an expert at the long goodbye. And maybe that's the point. Nothing is meant to last forever. Not the Roman Empire, not the Republic of Venice, not us. We are all just piles of wood driven into the mud, holding up something beautiful for a little while. And right now that beautiful thing is rest. So, look out at the water one last time. See the little lights of the fishing boats way out in the lagoon, bobbing up and down, rhythmic, gentle. The city is turning off the lights. The fog is rolling in, wrapping the bell towers in cotton. The sharp edges are softening. The marble is cooling down. The Lion of St. Mark has put down his book. He's closing his eyes. The pigeons are tucked into the eaves of the basilica, heads under their wings. The gondolas are moored, covered in blue tarps, rocking gently at their poles. Creak, splash, creak, splash. It's time to leave the history books closed. We don't need to know the dates anymore. We don't need to know the names of the doges. We don't need to worry about the cracks in the walls. We just need the water. Imagine you are lying in one of those boats. The cushions are soft velvet. The boat is swaying. Just a tiny bit. Left, right, left, right. The sky above is a deep, dark indigo. The stars are blurry through the mist. You are safe in the lagoon. The storm is gone. The tourists are gone. It's just you and the ancient, silent water, drifting slowly toward the open sea. The sounds of the city are fading behind you. No more bells, no more voices, just the breath of the tide, in and out, in and out. The heavy velvet of the night is pulling over you. Warm, dark, quiet. The story is over. The book is closed. The water is still. Good night, Venice. Good night, guys. Sweet dreams. The end. Sweet dreams.